Conundrum Audio presents The Hope Ornament by Nick Thacker, produced by Nick Thacker and Conundrum Publishing, copyright 2025 by Conundrum Publishing. For more awesome thrillers and amazing audiobooks, visit www.conundrumpublishing.com.
The Hope Ornament, a Harvey Bennett story. Nick Thacker.
Chapter 1.
The windshield wipers scraped rhythmically against the snow-slicked glass, a futile attempt to keep the road ahead visible. Ben hunched over the steering wheel, squinting through the growing flurry. The headlights illuminated a narrow ribbon of pavement flanked by towering pines and blanketed fields of untouched snow.
"This was a great idea,"
he muttered under his breath, not quite loud enough for Julie to hear. "What's that?" she asked, glancing up from her phone, where she'd been scrolling reviews of local hot chocolate shops. "Nothing," Ben said quickly. He tightened his grip on the wheel as the car hit a patch of ice and slid, just for a second. His stomach flipped, but he straightened them out, refusing to show any sign of alarm. "Just saying how much I love a scenic drive." Julie smirked, catching his sarcasm immediately. "Oh, come on. This is perfect. A cozy little Christmas getaway. What's not to love? Friendly people, ice, possibly hypothermia." She ignored him, looking back down at her phone. "Look, they've got a gingerbread house competition at the festival tonight. Think we should enter?" "Pass," Ben said, his tone as flat as the rental car's spare tire would be if they hit a pothole out here. "Plus, I saw there might be a storm coming in later. I definitely don't want to get stuck in that. It's already cold enough out there." The GPS chirped, announcing their arrival at Hope, Alaska. Ben slowed the car as they crested a hill, and the town spread out before them like something from the inside of a snow globe. Low buildings with steep roofs lined either side of the main street, their windows glowing with warm golden light. Strings of Christmas lights twinkled above the road, strung between lampposts wrapped in garlands. At the center of town, a massive fir tree stood adorned with ornaments, ribbons, and what looked like enough tinsel to cover the entire Rocky Mountain range. Julie let out a little gasp. "Ben, look at this place. It's beautiful." He didn't respond immediately, too focused on navigating the icy road into town. The tires crunched softly as they passed by a group of bundled-up children building a snowman near a wooden bench. One of them waved, and Ben, to his own surprise, waved back. "See? Even you're getting into the spirit," Julie teased. "I waved. That doesn't mean I'm buying a wreath and singing carols." She laughed. "Baby steps." They pulled into the parking lot of the Hope Lodge, a squat, two-story building with wide wooden beams and a carved sign that read, "Warm stays, warmer hearts." Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and soft light glowed through the frosted windows. A few other cars were parked nearby, their roofs piled with snow. "Looks cozy," Julie said as she climbed out of the car, pulling her coat tighter against the sharp wind. Ben grabbed their bags from the back seat, muttering something about frostbite as they trudged toward the entrance. Inside, the lodge was a different world. The cold was replaced by a wave of warmth and the comforting scent of wood smoke and pine. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel lined with evergreen boughs and red bows. A Christmas tree, slightly smaller than the one outside, stood in the corner, its ornaments glinting in the firelight. Ben dropped their bags near the front desk, rolling his shoulders to shake off the lingering chill. "Welcome to Hope Lodge," said a plump, rosy-cheeked woman behind the counter. She wore a red scarf that matched the poinsettias on the desk. "Checking in?" Julie stepped forward, her smile as bright as the holiday lights outside. "Yes, we've got a reservation under Bennett." The woman clapped her hands together. "Ah, yes, Bennett. The King Suite, perfect for a romantic weekend. Fireplace, dining table. It's cozy, but not small. Ben raised an eyebrow. King suite? Fancy. Julie elbowed him playfully. Don't act like you're above it. You're the one who insisted on splurging after the last motel disaster. That place had character, Ben said, but he didn't argue further. As the woman handed over their room key, she added, "And you're just in time for the festival kickoff tonight. The opening ceremony starts at 7 in the town square. You don't want to miss it. It's the highlight of the season, where Mayor Franklin reveals our pride and joy. The Golden Star, our hope ornament. The town triples in size. Even some Anchorage folks make it down." Julie's eyes lit up. "We'll be there." Ben groaned inwardly. Their room was indeed cozy, as well appointed as the lodge's lobby, complete with a huge bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a window that looked out over the snow-covered rooftops of the town. He spotted a clawfoot bathtub with another picturesque bay window standing over it in the bathroom. Ben dropped their bags by the door and flopped onto the bed, groaning with exaggerated relief. "Wake me up when it's over," he said, closing his eyes. Julie pulled off her coat and scarf, tossing them onto a nearby chair. "Nice try. We're going to the festival, and you're going to have fun whether you like it or not." Define fun, Ben muttered. In truth, he was happy to be here. Sure, he missed Hope, but it was nice to get away with just his wife for once. Still, he had a role to play. He was the reclusive curmudgeon, and he couldn't let his outgoing, extroverted wife win. But the place had charm. He couldn't deny that. The town square was alive with activity when they arrived that evening. Booths lined the streets, offering everything from spiced cider to handmade ornaments. The air was filled with the scent of roasting chestnuts and the sound of carolers singing off-key but enthusiastically. Ben followed Julie as she flitted from booth to booth, her excitement as contagious as the cold. He couldn't help but smile, just a little, when she held up a pair of knit mittens decorated with reindeer. "Wouldn't these look cute on Hope?" she asked. Ben nodded. "Sure, if she doesn't try to eat them first." Julie laughed, but her expression softened at the mention of their daughter. "I miss her already." "Me too," Ben answered. "But she's fine," he continued, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "Spoiled rotten with your parents probably eating cookies for dinner." Julie leaned into him, her smile returning. The mayor took the stage as the crowd gathered near the massive Christmas tree. Dressed in a heavy coat and a fur-lined hat, he looked every bit the part of a small-town leader, his booming voice carrying easily over the festive noise. "Welcome to Hope's annual Christmas festival," he began, eliciting cheers from the crowd. Ben tuned out most of the speech, sipping his cider, spiked, thankfully, as Julie listened intently. He caught bits and pieces about the town's history and the festival's traditions, but it wasn't until the mayor mentioned the Golden Star of Hope that Ben's attention sharpened. "As you all know," Mayor Franklin said, "the Golden Star is more than just an ornament. It's a symbol of this town's resilience and a reminder of the spirit of hope that has carried us through generations. Locked up tightly in our local bank's vault during the year, today marks the day it is brought out and put on display, our annual Christmas tradition, which represents unity, peace, and, of course, Christmas spirit." Ben leaned closer to Julie. "Wait," he began. "The ornament that's got everyone all hot and bothered is just an actual ornament?" She nodded. "Isn't it fascinating? The blacksmith who made it was a genius. I looked it up. There's even a legend about it containing a cipher that leads to lost gold." "Lost gold," Ben repeated, smirking. "Of course there's a treasure story. What's a Christmas festival without a little adventure?" Julie rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. Chapter 2. The air buzzed with applause, as the mayor cut the ribbon strung across the museum's front doors. The sharp snip of the scissors barely carried over the cheers, but the crowd surged with excitement as the doors swung open. A warm, golden light spilled out onto the snow-covered steps, illuminating the Heritage Museum's modest interior. An old rail car, clearly one that had seen some actual use long ago, was on display in a back corner, consuming most of the space on that side of the small building. It was small for a train car, but in this cramped space it looked massive. Mining tools hung from hooks on the wall near it, each with a placard explaining its use and propriety. In the opposite corner, Ben saw a spindle kiosk with tiny books and souvenir keychains on it, a staple of any self-respecting small-town museum. At the center of it all was the golden star of hope. Even from the edge of the square just outside the building, Ben could see it glowing from a backlight in its glass case, perched on a pedestal just inside the entrance. It was clear it had been moved here for this occasion, as it nearly blocked the entrance completely. On it, the ornament shimmered, its intricate carvings catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. Julie squeezed his arm. "It's even more beautiful than I thought," she whispered, her eyes wide with childlike wonder. Ben nodded, though he didn't share her awe. Something about the whole display felt too perfect, too vulnerable. It was like hanging a neon sign on a priceless artifact saying, "Please, steal me." Not to mention it's just an ornament. Simple, nothing fancy, except for the fact that it had been fashioned from gold. He was about to crack a joke about the lack of security when the first scream pierced the air. It came from somewhere in the crowd, sharp and panicked, followed by a low murmur of confusion. People turned toward the square's far corner, where three figures in heavy black coats and ski masks were shoving their way through the crowd. Ben's body tensed immediately, his instincts kicking in before his mind fully registered what was happening. The leader of the group, a stocky man wielding a crowbar, barked a command. "Everybody down! Now!" The crowd erupted into chaos. People scrambled to get out of the way, some diving for cover behind benches or vendor stalls. Others froze in place, their breaths puffing white in the cold air as fear rooted them to the spot. Ben grabbed Julie's hand and pulled her toward the edge of the square, his mind racing. "Ben," she started, but he cut her off. "Stay low, don't argue." She didn't protest, ducking beside him as they crouched behind a vendor cart selling spiced cider. The sweet, cloying scent mixed incongruously with the adrenaline spiking through his system. The three attackers moved with ruthless efficiency. The leader strode up the museum steps, crowbar in hand, while the second, a wiry figure carrying a pistol, scanned the crowd for any sign of resistance. The third, larger than the other two, carried an empty burlap sack slung over one shoulder. Ben's pulse quickened as the leader raised the crowbar and swung it in a powerful arc. The sound of shattering glass echoed across the square as the museum's doors gave way. "Someone's got to stop them," Julie whispered, her voice tight with fear and frustration. Ben didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the pistol-wielding attacker, calculating the odds. No backup, no weapon, just a sharp mind and maybe, if he was lucky, a dumb mistake on their part. "Stay here," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. Julie grabbed his arm. "Ben." "I mean it, Jules. Don't move." She released him reluctantly, her expression a mix of fear and anger. The leader smashed his way into the museum, shards of glass crunching under his boots as he strode toward the Golden Star's display. Inside, the warm light of the exhibit contrasted sharply with the cold, clinical efficiency of the theft. Ben crept closer, sticking to the shadows along the edge of the square. The pistol wielder stood at the top of the steps, scanning the crowd. but their attention faltered every few seconds as their focus darted between the crowd and the museum's entrance. Ben didn't see any police, but he knew they were around, perhaps plain clothes. Still, no one moved with authority toward the attackers. The burlap sack was already in play. Ben could see the stocky leader inside the museum, slamming the crowbar into the glass case that housed the golden star. The display shattered with a sickening crunch, fragments cascading onto the floor. The ornament, smaller than it had appeared under the lights, was snatched up in a gloved hand and shoved unceremoniously into the sack. Ben's jaw tightened. These guys weren't professionals. They were fast, sure, but they were reckless, smashing and grabbing without care for subtlety or precision. It wasn't about the art or the history, it was about the gold. The pistol wielder shouted something. Ben couldn't make it out over the rising panic of the crowd, but it was enough to send the leader and the third man sprinting back towards the square. Ben pressed himself against the side of a building as the three figures regrouped, their boots crunching loudly in the snow. The sack now swung heavily in the stocky man's grip, the shadowy form of the golden star visible through the thin burlap weave. They moved quickly, cutting through the square toward the far alley. Ben's eyes darted back to Julie, still crouched behind the cider cart. She met his gaze, her expression fierce and questioning. "Stay put," he mouthed silently. And then he moved. Ben cut across the square, using the chaos of the fleeing crowd as cover. He reached the alley's edge just as the attackers disappeared into the shadows, their footsteps echoing against the narrow walls. He slipped into the alley, keeping his movements silent and deliberate. The cold air bit at his face, but his focus was laser-sharp, his body humming with the familiar tension of a hunt. The attackers were moving fast, but not fast enough. They hadn't noticed him yet. Chapter 3. Ben's boots slid on the icy ground as he surged forward, his focus narrowing to the pistol-wielding attacker standing at the base of the museum steps. He wasn't thinking anymore. Not consciously, at least. Training and instinct had taken over, his body moving before his mind caught up. The sound of panicked screams rippled across the square, mingling with the crunch of feet on snow and the distant jingle of Christmas music still blaring from a speaker near the tree. Children were crying, their high-pitched wails cutting through the chaos like a knife. Vendors shouted frantic warnings, their carts overturned in the rush to flee. Ben pushed it all to the back of his mind. The attackers were his focus now. Nothing else mattered. The man with the pistol was scanning the crowd, his movements jerky and panicked. His free hand twitched at his side, and the barrel of the gun swept dangerously close to a huddled group of bystanders. Ben's jaw tightened. He closed the distance in 3 quick strides, slamming into the man's side with enough force to knock him off balance. The attacker staggered, his pistol jerking upward, and Ben capitalized, grabbing the man's wrist with one hand and driving his other elbow into the attacker's ribs. The gun went off, a sharp, deafening crack that echoed across the square. The shot went wild, harmlessly punching a hole in the museum's wooden doorframe. More screams added to the chaos. Ben twisted the man's wrist, forcing the gun to clatter to the ground and shoved the attacker back against the stone steps. The man lashed out wildly, his fist clipping Ben's cheekbone. Pain flared, but Ben ignored it, slamming his knee into the attacker's stomach and following it with a quick punch to the side of his head. The man slumped, dazed but still conscious, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ben didn't have time to finish him off. The leader was already halfway down the steps, the burlap sack and crowbar swinging at his side. The third man, the massive, broad-shouldered figure who looked like he could bench press a truck, stood between Ben and the fleeing leader, cracking his knuckles like he was itching for a fight. Ben grabbed the pistol off the ground and slid it across the ice, sending it spinning far out of reach. Then he turned to face the big man, his fists clenching at his sides.
Move,
Ben growled. The big man grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. He didn't move. Ben didn't wait for an invitation. He darted forward, feinting left before driving his shoulder into the man's midsection. It was like hitting a brick wall, but the move forced the man back a step, his boots skidding slightly on the icy pavement. The big man countered with a wild swing, his massive fist arcing toward Ben's head. Ben ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow, and delivered a quick jab to the man's ribs. It was like punching a tree trunk, but the man grunted, a flicker of pain crossing his face. Before Ben could press the advantage, the man lashed out with his other hand, grabbing a fistful of Ben's coat and yanking him forward. Ben twisted, breaking free of the man's grip, but the motion left him off balance. The big man capitalized, driving his knee into Ben's stomach and sending him sprawling backward into the snow. Ben's breath rushed out of him in a harsh gasp, but he rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the man's boot as it stomped down where his chest had been a moment before. Ben came up swinging, his fist connecting with the man's jaw in a sharp uppercut. The big man staggered, his arms flailing for balance, and Ben followed with a quick hook to the temple. The man hit the ground hard, his bulk sending up a spray of snow. Ben didn't wait to see if he'd stay down. He turned, his eyes locking on the leader, who was now sprinting across the square with the sack in hand.
Julie, stay here,
Ben shouted over his shoulder as he took off after the fleeing man. Julie's voice cut through the chaos behind him, sharp with worry. Ben, be careful. He didn't look back. The leader was fast, but Ben was faster. His boots pounded against the snow-packed pavement as he closed the distance, his breath fogging in the freezing air. The golden ornament glinted through a tear in the burlap sack, its glow almost mocking in its brilliance. They rounded the corner of the museum, plunging into a narrow alleyway lit only by the dim orange glow of a street lamp. The walls closed in on either side, the snow underfoot giving way to rough asphalt. The leader glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wide with panic. He reached into his coat and pulled out a knife, the blade catching the light as he turned to face Ben. Ben slowed, his body tensing as he assessed the situation. The knife was a problem, but the man's grip was unsteady, his movements frantic. He wasn't a trained fighter, just a desperate thief. The leader lunged, slashing wildly with the knife. Ben sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and Ben followed up with a quick jab to the man's face. The leader stumbled back, but he didn't go down. He swung the burlap sack at Ben like a weapon, the weight of the ornament inside giving it enough momentum to make Ben duck. Ben surged forward, tackling the man around the waist and driving him into the alley wall. The impact knocked the wind out of the leader, and the sack slipped from his grasp, hitting the ground with a dull thud. Ben didn't stop. He drove his fist into the man's stomach, then followed with an elbow to the side of his head. The leader crumpled, groaning, as he slid to the ground. As he reached the sack, the leader of the trio also grabbed at it, then tried to shuffle backwards and to his feet. Ben held on, and a tug-of-war match began. He turned just as the big man from earlier rounded the corner, his face a mask of fury.
Of course, you're back,
Ben muttered, bracing himself. The big man stood like a bull, ready to charge, his heavy boots shaking the alleyway with each step. Ben planted his feet, his grip tightening on the sack. "Let's finish this," he growled. Chapter 4. "Forget it," the leader shouted to his accomplices, his voice cracking with desperation. "Get out of here." The broad-shouldered man, just yards away, hesitated for a brief moment, his fists still clenched and his face twisted in frustration. But when the wiry attacker, the one Ben had taken down earlier, reappeared from the shadows and grabbed at his arm, the bigger man snarled and gave up. Ben saw it in their movements and confirmed his previous suspicion. This wasn't a unified team. This was a group of desperate individuals, thrown together for a job that was unraveling faster than they could handle. They didn't care about covering each other. They cared about getting away. The leader hadn't called out to his men because he was worried for their safety. He simply didn't want to leave behind any loose ends. The wiry man pulled at the big one's sleeve again. "Come on, he'll get the star." The two of them turned, their heavy boots crunching in the snow, and bolted down the nearest alleyway. The leader snarled something unintelligible, his breath fogging in the freezing air. He made one last attempt to yank himself free, his body twisting violently as he pulled. Ben felt his grip slip as it took him by surprise, and then the leader, and the ornament, was gone. He heard a shout, one of the thieves, he guessed, and the sound of another shuffle. Perhaps one of them had fallen down, or a cop had finally appeared and apprehended them, but Ben couldn't see. Ben stumbled back, barely catching himself as the noise from beyond the alley died down again. He growled in frustration, but before he could chase after them, something new caught his eye. A small, crumpled piece of paper fluttered to the ground where the leader had been standing moments ago. It landed in the snow, almost invisible against the white, but Ben's sharp gaze caught the faint lines of ink on its surface. The attackers were gone now, their dark forms vanishing into the swirling snow. Ben bent down, his breath heavy, and picked up the paper. He smoothed it out against his thigh, his fingers stiff from the cold. The paper was damp and creased, but the faint sketch of a mining claim symbol stood out clearly, its lines rough but deliberate. Below it, written in hurried, almost illegible script, were partial coordinates, a string of numbers that cut off halfway through. Ben frowned, turning the paper over in his hands. Nothing. "Ben!" He turned at the sound of Julie's voice, his heart pounding. She was running toward him, her coat flapping behind her and her scarf trailing like a banner in the wind. Relief flooded through him when he saw her unharmed, but it was quickly replaced by a tight knot of worry in his chest. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice breathless, as she reached him. "I'm fine," he said, tucking the paper into his coat pocket. "You?" "I'm okay." She glanced over her shoulder at the square where the crowd was slowly beginning to regroup. What happened? Did they get away? Ben nodded grimly. Yeah, but not before one of them dropped this. He pulled the paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Julie tilted her head as she examined the sketch, her gloved fingers tracing the outline of the mining claim symbol. Her expression shifted, the light in her eyes sharpening into something Ben recognized instantly. "You've seen this before," he said, not bothering to phrase it as a question. Julie hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Maybe. My dad used to talk about stuff like this, symbols tied to old mining claims from the late 1800s. He said there were rumors about claims that went missing or were hidden during the gold rush." "Hidden," Ben repeated, his voice flat. "Let me guess. Treasure maps, secret caches, that kind of thing?" Julie gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. "I thought they were just stories, legends he researched for fun. He told me all this stuff when I was a kid, but this," she held up the paper, "this feels real." Ben's gaze shifted to the snowy street where the attackers had disappeared. "Real enough to steal for," he muttered. The faint wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the lingering panic of the square. 2 police cruisers slid to a stop near the edge of the crowd, their lights splashing red and blue across the snow. Officers poured out, their hands on their weapons as they assessed the scene. Ben turned his attention back to Julie. "Whatever this is," he said, his tone low and steady, "it's more than a heist. They weren't just after the ornament, they were after whatever it's hiding." Julie's eyes locked on his, her expression tense but resolute. "We need to figure out where this leads," she said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. Ben nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. His breath misted in the cold air as he glanced back toward the alley, his mind already racing. This wasn't just a random robbery. They were in the middle of something much bigger and much more dangerous. The square was still a mess when the police began organizing the crowd. People were huddled in groups, their voices low and anxious, as they recounted the events to the officers. The shattered glass in the museum glittered in the snow, a stark reminder of how quickly the idyllic evening had turned to chaos. Ben stayed near the edge of the square, keeping his head low as he watched the scene unfold. He wasn't ready to explain what had happened. Not yet. Julie stood beside him, her hands stuffed into her pockets, as she stared at the crumpled paper. The faint lines of the mining symbol seemed to glow faintly in the light from the nearby lampposts, as though it were daring them to uncover its secrets. "What do you think it means?" she asked, breaking the silence. Ben shook his head. "I don't know, but we're not going to figure it out here." Julie glanced toward the museum, where the police were cordoning off the entrance. Her jaw tightened. "They're not going to find those guys in this storm. They're long gone." "Yeah," Ben said quietly. "But they left us a trail." Julie looked back at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you think we can find them?" Ben's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. "We don't have a choice." Julie nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's get back to the lodge," Ben said, glancing toward the square one last time. "We need to figure out our next move." Julie fell into step beside him as they headed down the snowy street, the paper tucked safely into Ben's pocket. The storm swirled around them, the wind howling like a warning. Ben didn't know what they were walking into, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to end here. Chapter 5. The wind battered the windows of the lodge with a relentless fury. The howling storm outside so fierce it felt like the whole building was under siege. Snow piled against the glass, obscuring the world beyond in a thick, swirling white. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth crackled warmly, its glow casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. Ben slumped in a chair by the fire, his elbows resting on his knees and his fingers clutching the crumpled piece of paper. His gaze was fixed on it, as though staring hard enough might force it to reveal its secrets. But the rough sketch of the mining symbol and the partial coordinates offered no new insights, just the same maddening questions that had been rattling in his head since the attack. Julie sat opposite him, her cheeks still pink from the cold as she peeled off her scarf and gloves. She shook the snow from her hair and stretched her fingers toward the fire, letting the heat chase away the lingering chill. Her face was alive with curiosity, the corners of her mouth twitching as though she were on the verge of piecing together some vital clue. "Let me see it again," she said, her voice cutting through the storm's muffled roar. Ben sighed and passed her the paper without a word. Julie smoothed it out on the coffee table between them, her brow furrowing as she studied the sketch. Her fingers traced the lines of the mining claim symbol, pausing at the faint pencil marks beneath it. "This is driving me crazy," she muttered. "I know I've seen this before. It's so familiar, but I can't place it." Ben leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Great. So we've got half a treasure map and a vague sense of déjà vu. That's helpful." Julie shot him a look. "You know, you could try being a little more optimistic for once." "Optimism gets people killed," Ben said flatly. Julie rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Instead, she leaned closer to the table, her eyes narrowing as she examined the paper. "This symbol," she murmured, more to herself than to Ben. "It's not just random, it's deliberate, like it's marking something specific. And these coordinates, they're incomplete. But they might be enough to start figuring out the general area. Ben watched her for a moment, his skepticism warring with a flicker of reluctant admiration. Julie had always had a way of diving headfirst into things, her determination as unshakable as it was occasionally reckless. "Didn't you say your dad used to talk about symbols like this?" Ben asked, his tone careful. Julie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "He was obsessed with the gold rush. He had all these old books about mining claims and lost treasure. He'd show me pictures of the symbols miners used to mark their territories. Things like this." She tapped the paper. They were supposed to be simple, but unique, something that could stand the test of time. Ben tilted his head. "And you're saying this is one of those?" "I don't know," Julie admitted. "But it's close. It's almost like—" She trailed off, biting her lip as her fingers drummed against the edge of the table. Ben waited, giving her the space to work through her thoughts. Finally, she straightened, her eyes bright with an idea. "We need to start with what we have here," she said, tapping the paper again. "The symbol and the coordinates. There's got to be something in the town records, or even online, that connects this to something concrete." Ben raised an eyebrow. "You want to Google a 100-year-old mining claim?" Julie smiled, a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "Stranger things have worked." Ben groaned, dragging a hand down his face. "This is how I know we're in trouble." Julie ignored him, already pulling her laptop out of her bag. She placed it on the table and powered it on, her fingers tapping impatiently as the screen flickered to life. "Let's just see what we can find," she said, her voice steady with determination. Ben stood and walked to the window, staring out at the storm. The snow was coming down harder now, the wind whipping it into frenzied spirals that obscured the buildings across the street. They were cut off from the rest of the world, isolated in this little mountain town with nothing but a vague clue and Julie's relentless curiosity to guide them. "I hate storms like this," he muttered. Julie glanced up from her screen. "Why? They're kind of romantic." "Romantic until you're stuck in a snowdrift with a broken axle," Ben said. Julie laughed softly, her eyes flicking back to the screen. "You're such a pessimist." Ben smiled. He turned back to the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. The warmth was soothing, but his mind was anything but calm. "Got something," Julie said a few minutes later, her voice cutting through the quiet. Ben crossed the room in 2 strides, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. She had pulled up an old map of the area, its faded lines tracing the mountain ranges and rivers that had defined the region during the gold rush. "This symbol," Julie said, pointing to a spot near the bottom of the map. "It's not exactly the same." "No, but it's damn close," Ben said. "It's a mining claim marker, tied to a stretch of land about 20 miles south of here." Ben frowned. "And you think that's what this is pointing to?" Julie nodded. "It's possible. If we can figure out the full coordinates, we might be able to narrow it down." Ben stared at the screen, his mind racing. The symbol, the coordinates, the attackers, they all fit together in a way that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. "What else do you know about this area?" he asked, his tone serious. Julie hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Not much. My dad always said there were stories about hidden gold claims all over the western United States and Canada, but a lot of it, by his admission, was just legend. I never thought there was any truth to it." Ben straightened, his jaw tightening. "Well, someone else does. And they seem willing to do whatever it takes to get to it." Julie looked up at him, her expression steady despite the gravity of his words. "Then we need to find it first." Chapter 6. Julie's fingers tapped steadily on her laptop keyboard, the faint clicks breaking the quiet of the lodge's lounge. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, filling the room with a warm, amber glow that danced across the wooden walls. Despite the coziness of their surroundings, the weight of the night's events hung over them like a storm cloud refusing to move on. Ben leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking between Julie and the crumpled paper sitting on the coffee table between them. She hadn't looked up in over 10 minutes, her focus entirely on the screen in front of her. "You've been at this a while," Ben said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Find anything yet?" Julie didn't respond immediately, her brow furrowed, her fingers pausing mid-keystroke as she stared at the screen. Finally, she let out a soft hum, her lips quirking in a small, satisfied smile. "Maybe," she said, tilting the screen toward him. Ben leaned forward, his skepticism tempered by curiosity. The image on the screen was an old black-and-white photograph of a group of miners standing in front of a wooden building. Above them, a weathered sign read, "Grady's Hope Mining Company." "Grady's Hope," Julie said, sitting back in her chair. "Apparently, one of the biggest mining operations in the region during the gold rush. I wonder if my dad ever researched them." Ben raised an eyebrow. "This is familiar territory for you, huh?" Julie nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah, he was obsessed with this stuff, old mines, lost claims, treasure stories. He used to say the real history wasn't in the books, but in the legends people told about what was left behind." Ben let out a soft snort. "Legends, always reliable." Julie ignored him, her eyes drifting back to the screen. "There's more to this than just the company, though. A shipment of gold disappeared in 1898. It was supposed to be one of the largest shipments Grady's Hope ever sent out, but it never made it to its destination." "Let me guess," Ben said, his voice dry. "It vanished under mysterious circumstances." "Pretty much," Julie said, reading parts of the story on her screen. "The official record states that it was stolen, but there were rumors that the miners hid it deliberately. Pretty common for the time, really. No one fully trusted anyone involved. The people they were supposed to deliver it to, rivals, corrupt officials, that kind of thing. And it's been missing ever since," Ben said, leaning back in his chair. Julie nodded. "If it's still out there, it'd be worth a fortune." Ben's gaze shifted to the crumpled paper on the table, the mining claim symbol staring back at him like a challenge. "And you think this symbol is connected to that shipment?" "I do," Julie said firmly. "This symbol, it's definitely the recreation of a claim marker. Miners use them to mark their territories or hide their stashes. My dad used to show me drawings of them in his books. This one's different, but it's close enough that I think it's legit. The fact that these guys had it on them means it's probably what we're after." Ben tilted his head, studying her. "And what about the ornament? Where does that fit into all this?" Julie hesitated for a moment, her fingers drumming against the edge of the table. The ornament would have been made around the same time the shipment disappeared. It wasn't just a decoration. Apparently, it was a coded artifact, remember? Again, not uncommon. Something miners would use to protect their fortunes. Coded onto knickknacks like spoons, mess kits, stones, whatever. They're like the key, meant to be used with the right clues to unlock whatever it was hiding. A crude but effective way to keeping secrets, and only letting those you truly trust find what you've got hidden. Ben frowned, his mind turning over the possibilities. "So you're saying the ornament is the key, and this," he gestured to the paper, "is part of the map." "Exactly," Julie said, her eyes bright with conviction. Ben let out a long breath, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "Let's say you're right. Why would they hide the gold instead of using it? What's the point of going to all this trouble if they're not going to spend it?" Julie's expression grew thoughtful, her voice softening. My dad used to say people only hide what they can't afford to lose. If the stakes were high enough, if the wrong people were after them, they might not have had a choice. Ben shook his head, still skeptical. Or they buried it so deep they forgot where they put it. Julie laughed softly. Maybe, but I don't think so. If they went to this much trouble, it was for a reason. And if that shipment is still out there, someone knows it. Ben rubbed a hand over his face, his jaw tightening as he considered her words. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made his gut twist. The attackers at the museum, the stolen ornament, the mining symbol, it all pointed to something bigger than a simple robbery. And those guys tonight, Julie continued, her voice steady. They're not amateurs. They knew exactly what they were after. Whatever this is, it's worth risking a lot for. Ben sighed, glancing toward the window. The storm outside had intensified, the wind rattling the glass in its frame. Okay, he said finally. Let's say we're onto something. What's next? Julie's expression brightened, her determination shining through. We start with what we have. The symbol and the partial coordinates. If we can figure out where they point, we might find more clues. Ben raised an eyebrow. You're planning to piece together and follow a treasure map in the middle of a snowstorm? Why not? Julie said with a grin. We've done crazier things. Ben chuckled despite himself, shaking his head. If we end up knee-deep in some cave chasing this, I'm blaming you. Julie's grin widened. Deal. The fire crackled softly as they settled back into their seats, the weight of the mystery settling between them. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the lodge, a sense of purpose began to take root. Whatever they were chasing, it was just getting started. Chapter 7. The police station bustled with post-festival chaos the next morning. Phones rang incessantly, officers shuffled between desks piled high with paperwork, and the air carried the faint, stale smell of coffee and damp wool. The narrow corridors were a maze of noise and exhaustion, but Ben and Julie moved with purpose, their steps echoing on the worn linoleum. A young officer at the front desk barely looked up as they approached. Help you folks with something? We're here about the museum theft, Julie said, her tone sharper than usual. The officer glanced at them with a mix of curiosity and recognition. Ah, yeah, you're the ones who helped stop it, right? Sheriff Burleson was asking if anyone knew you. We're the ones who tackled a guy while the rest got away with exactly what they came for, Ben said dryly. So I don't think we helped much of anything. How's that rat doing, by the way? The officer motioned them through a side door. Come on, I'll show you. They followed him down a hallway lined with old case files and faded posters warning against petty crimes. The officer pushed open a door at the end of the hall, revealing a small holding area. Behind the metal bars of one of the cells sat the wiry thief Ben had tackled. The man sat slouched on the bench, his head bowed and his cuffed hands resting limply in his lap. He didn't move or acknowledge their presence, his defiance clear even in his silence. He hasn't said a word since we brought him in, the officer explained. Not his name, not who he's working for, nothing. Julie stepped closer to the bars, her eyes narrowing as she studied the man. What about the others? Do you guys have any leads? The officer sighed, frustration flickering across his face. Vanished. Storm covered their tracks. Burleson's got people looking, but he says odds are slim, and he's rarely wrong. Julie exhaled sharply, crossing her arms. And the ornament? The officer shook his head. Still missing. We figure the group has it. This guy didn't have anything on him when we brought him in, but we've got eyewitnesses that he was the one holding the gun. That'll get him at least some time in here while we piece everything else together." Ben's gaze lingered on the thief, his mind churning with questions. "So, what's the plan for finding the ornament? You just wait for him to talk?" The officer shrugged. "Unless he cracks, we've got nothing solid to go on. Sheriff's out checking into a few threads, but as he says, you start pulling threads, you often just unravel the sweater." Julie turned away, frustration clear in the tight line of her jaw. "What about leads? You have to have some idea who's behind this." The officer hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if checking who might be listening. Then he lowered his voice. "Look, it's not official, but I'm pretty sure Wendell Griggs is involved." Julie frowned. "Who's Wendell Griggs?" "A financier," the officer explained. "Big name in the area. He's been buying up land and businesses in Hope for the past few years. Says he wants to revitalize the town, but a lot of people think he's got ulterior motives." Ben crossed his arms. "What kind of motives?" The officer hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. Griggs's family used to own several mining claims in the area, some of them tied to Grady's Hope. He's been digging into the town's history, trying to get his hands on anything connected to the gold rush. Rumor has it, he's obsessed with finding that missing shipment. Julie's head snapped toward him, her eyes sharp. "The shipment from Grady's Hope?" The officer nodded. "Yeah, you've heard the stories, right? Supposedly worth a fortune, but it vanished over 100 years ago. Most people think it's just a legend, but Griggs doesn't seem to agree." Ben leaned against the wall, his skepticism plain. "So Griggs buys up property and hires a bunch of thugs to steal a museum ornament? Seems a little extreme." The officer let out a low sigh. "Griggs doesn't play by the same rules as the rest of us. If he thinks that ornament is the key to the shipment, he'd do whatever it takes to get it." Julie went still, her gaze shifting to the floor as the officer's words sank in. "Wait, what did you say?" The officer frowned. "I said Griggs thinks the ornament is the key." "No, before that," Julie said quickly. "You said he's been digging into the town's history. What exactly has he been looking at?" "Old claims, mostly," the officer said. "Maps, ledgers, records from Grady's Hope. One of the areas he seems to be focused on is Boulder's Reach. A lot of the old mines from the gold rush are concentrated there." Julie's breath hitched, and she glanced at Ben, her eyes wide with realization. "What is it?" Ben asked. "The symbol," Julie said, her voice urgent. "The claim marker on the paper. It matches what he's talking about, Boulder's Reach. That must be where the coordinates point." Ben frowned, pulling the crumpled paper from his pocket and smoothing it out. He stared at the partial coordinates beneath the mining symbol, the faint pencil marks teasing at answers. "You're sure?" "Yes," Julie said firmly. "It's the only thing that makes sense. Griggs must have figured out the same connection, which is why he sent his men after the ornament. He's trying to find the gold before anyone else does." The officer looked between them, confusion flickering across his face. "You two seem awfully invested in this. What's your angle?" Julie didn't answer, already pulling Ben toward the door. "Thank you," she called over her shoulder. "You've been very helpful." The officer blinked, watching them go. "Yeah, sure." Outside, the snow had softened to a light dusting, the air crisp and clear. Julie stopped abruptly on the steps of the station, turning to face Ben. "We have to go to Boulder's Reach," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "In this weather?" Ben asked, his voice edged with exasperation. "If Griggs or his crew gets there first, the town's entire history, and that gold, could be lost forever," Julie said fiercely. Ben sighed, tucking the paper back into his pocket. Fine, but if we're missing Christmas morning with hope for this, it had better be worth it. Julie smiled faintly, her resolve unshaken. It will be. Ben didn't respond, but as they made their way back toward the lodge, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were heading straight into the storm, both literal and figurative. Chapter 8. The rental midsize SUV growled and strained as it crawled up the narrow, snow-covered trail. Each turn of the tires sent loose snow spraying into the air, the vehicle fighting for traction against the icy incline. Visibility was practically non-existent, with the storm swirling around them like a living thing. The headlights cut through the haze in weak, narrow beams, illuminating the dense pines that lined the trail and the sheer cliffs that dropped off into darkness. Ben gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He leaned forward, as if getting closer to the windshield would somehow help him see through the storm. The wipers scraped rhythmically against the glass, their effort almost futile against the relentless snowfall. "Remind me again why we rented this thing," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "Because it's Alaska," Julie said without looking up from the crumpled paper in her lap. "And because neither of us wanted to drive our own cars into the middle of a snowstorm during a holiday trip." Ben snorted. "You mean because I didn't want my SUV sliding off a cliff, and you didn't want to put your family car through this misery?" "Exactly," Julie said, glancing at him. "And because this thing was advertised as being made for extreme conditions. Not sure how extreme they meant, though. Apparently not icy death road in the mountains extreme," Ben muttered. The SUV jolted as it hit a rock buried under the snow, sending both of them bouncing in their seats. Ben grumbled under his breath, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "This is insane," he said. "Driving into the wilderness, chasing mythical gold, in a rental car that's one skid away from a bad insurance claim." Julie smirked, still focused on the paper in her hands. Not mythical gold. Historical gold. Big difference. Ben let out a dry laugh. "Sure, let's call it that." The SUV fishtailed slightly as it hit another patch of ice, but Ben corrected quickly, his hands steady on the wheel. "You really think we're going to find anything out here?" Julie finally looked up, her expression softening slightly. "Maybe, maybe not. But if we don't try, we'll never know." Ben raised an eyebrow. "You're really convinced this is worth it, huh?" Julie nodded, her gaze flicking back to the map. "It's not just about the gold, Ben. It's about the story, the history. Helping this town uncover something that's been lost for over a century? That's worth it." Ben glanced at her, then back at the snowy trail ahead. "And the fact that this town shares a name with our daughter has nothing to do with it." Julie smiled faintly. "It's a happy coincidence. But no, that's not why we're here. We're helping because it matters." The SUV jolted again, the tires struggling for traction as the incline steepened. Ben cursed under his breath, gripping the wheel tighter. Julie glanced out the window, her breath fogging the glass. The pines rose like sentinels on either side of the trail, their snow-laden branches drooping under the weight of the storm. Beyond them, the cliffs dropped into an inky void, the faint sound of wind whistling through the canyon below. "It's not much farther," she said, her voice calm. "How can you tell?" Ben shot back. "Everything looks the same out here. Trees, snow, more trees." "Trust me," Julie said. "I have a good feeling about this." Ben muttered something inaudible, but kept driving, the SUV inching forward as the trail grew narrower. The trees began to thin, revealing a clearing up ahead. The headlights caught the jagged edges of derelict structures buried under snow, collapsed beams, rusted machinery, and the faint outlines of what might have once been cabins or storage sheds. The air seemed to change, the oppressive weight of the storm lifting slightly as they entered the clearing. Ben rolled the SUV to a stop, its tires crunching over the icy ground. For a moment, the only sound was the faint howl of the wind and the ticking of the cooling engine. Julie opened her door, stepping out into the freezing air. Her boots sank into the snow as she took a few steps forward, her breath visible in the dim light. She turned, her eyes scanning the derelict mining camp before landing on Ben. "This is it," she said, her voice steady with certainty. Ben climbed out, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. He followed Julie's gaze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "Boulder's Reach?" he muttered. "Looks like a great place to get lost, or eaten by a bear." Julie smirked, but her focus was already shifting back to the ruins. The camp was silent, its snow-covered structures standing like monuments to a forgotten time. Somewhere beneath all of this was the truth they were chasing, or so she hoped. Ben glanced at her, shaking his head with a faint smile. "All right, Jules, let's see what your good feeling gets us." Chapter 9. The camp was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears and set nerves on edge. Snow blanketed everything, muffling sound and reducing the world to shades of white and gray. Dilapidated shacks leaned precariously under the weight of years and snow, their roofs sagging and walls bowed. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered, half buried in drifts, and a solitary stone chimney jutted upward like a monument to forgotten labor. Ben scanned the area as he stepped out of the SUV, his boots crunching against the fresh snow. The scene felt almost too still, like the world had paused just for them. Julie moved to his side, her eyes taking in the derelict camp. "Creepy, isn't it?" Ben nodded. "Definitely gives off that last stop before the horror movie starts vibe." Julie rolled her eyes, but didn't argue. Her attention shifted to the ground, where faint tracks crossed the snow, too fresh to be from the storm. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice low. Ben followed her gaze, his expression darkening. "Grigg's men?" "Probably," Julie said. "But not recently. These tracks are old enough that they've softened a bit around the edges. A day, maybe 2. Ben let out a slow breath, scanning the perimeter. "Let's hope they're long gone." The two of them advanced cautiously into the camp, their eyes darting between the wreckage. The place was a mess of broken tools, overturned crates, and torn papers scattered across the snow. It wasn't just the decay of time, it was the aftermath of a search. "They were in a hurry," Julie muttered, kneeling to pick up a scrap of paper. It was faded and torn, the writing barely legible. She frowned, dropping it back into the snow. "This wasn't careful work." "Doesn't look like they found much either," Ben said, nudging a splintered crate with the toe of his boot. "Or if they did, they didn't care about the mess they left behind." Julie crouched beside an overturned workbench, her eyes scanning the debris with practiced precision. If they were rushing, they might have missed something. Ben smirked faintly. "That's optimistic." Julie shot him a look. "Or realistic. You'd be surprised how often people overlook the obvious when they're panicked or on a deadline. Plus, you said those guys weren't professionals. I'd bet they just came in and took the nuclear approach. Overturning everything, ripping stuff apart, grabbing anything that looks like it might have some value." Ben let her work, his focus shifting back to the tracks and the eerie quiet that hung over the camp. Though this place hadn't been an active mine for probably 100 years, he knew local kids and hikers had probably passed through numerous times. But there was a heaviness here as well, as if the snow that had fallen overnight was helping to hide something. Julie moved toward one of the shacks. Its roof partially collapsed under the weight of snow. The walls were warped, and the door hung crookedly from rusted hinges. She pushed it open cautiously, the sound of creaking wood breaking the silence. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint light filtering through cracks in the walls. Snow had drifted in through the broken roof, covering the floor in a thin, uneven layer. Julie's eyes swept the room, her gaze catching on a pile of debris in the far corner. A section of the floorboards had caved in, leaving jagged wood and broken planks jutting out at odd angles. She crossed the room, her boots crunching softly against the snow-covered floor. Kneeling by the debris, she ran her gloved fingers over the exposed boards. Something caught her eye, a faint mark on the wood, almost invisible under the dust and frost. "Ben," she called, her voice hushed but urgent. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, his broad frame filling the opening. "What is it?" "I think I found something," she said, brushing away the snow and debris with quick, deliberate movements. Ben stepped inside, his gaze shifting between Julie and the hole in the floor. "Careful. This place looks like it could come down any second." Julie ignored him, her focus entirely on the faint mark etched into the wood. It was a brand, a blacksmith's mark, identical to the one on the stolen ornament. "Help me move this," she said, gesturing to a heavy beam that had fallen across the opening. Ben hesitated but crouched beside her, gripping the beam with both hands. Together, they heaved it to the side, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside was a wooden crate, weathered but intact. Its lid was sealed with rusted nails, the same blacksmith's mark burned into the surface. Julie's breath caught as she lifted the crate from the compartment, her hands trembling slightly. She set it on the floor and pried the lid open with a sharp tug. Inside was a journal, its leather cover worn and fragile but still intact. Ben peered over her shoulder, his brows lifting. "That looks promising." Julie carefully lifted the journal from the crate, her fingers brushing off the dust. She opened it to the first page, the faint scrawl of a miner's hand filling the yellowed paper. It's a journal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben crossed his arms, his skepticism warring with curiosity. "From who?" "Has to be a miner," Julie said, flipping through the pages. "Maybe even the one who hid the shipment. Look at this." She stopped on a page near the middle, where a rough sketch filled the paper. It showed a network of tunnels and a rail line, with a set of coordinates scribbled beside it. "A secret rail line," Julie murmured. This must have been how they transported the gold without anyone knowing. Ben frowned, leaning closer. "Where is it? And where does it lead?" Julie traced her finger along the sketch, her mind racing. "It's a drive, but it's part of Boulder's Reach, and I think it's leading here." She pointed to a crude drawing. "A collapsed tunnel? Probably deeper in the mountains. If this map is even remotely right—" She trailed off, her thoughts clicking into place. The ornament must connect to this somehow. It's part of the cipher. Griggs must have found incomplete information here and realized he needed the ornament to finish it. But we found this, and it might give us a shortcut. If we can follow the old mining roads that roughly match the layout this guy's drawn here, I'd bet we'll find the secret rail system he's referring to, and we'll be one step ahead of Griggs. Ben straightened, his attention snapping back to the doorway. But that also means he's not done searching, and he does have the ornament. Julie looked up at him, her expression grim. "Which means we're running out of time." Ben raised a hand, silencing her, his head tilted slightly, his gaze narrowing. "What is it?" Julie whispered. "Voices," Ben said, his tone low. Julie froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Ben stepped closer to the doorway, his movements careful and deliberate. Through the falling snow, he could just make out two figures moving into the camp, their shapes silhouetted against the gray light. He gestured for Julie to stay quiet, his expression tense. "Looks like we've got company," he murmured. Chapter 10. Ben crouched low, his breath visible in the freezing air as he peered through the frost-covered window of the shack. Outside, the stocky leader from the museum heist barked orders to his massive companion, their voices cutting through the storm. Both men carried weapons, the leader with his pistol drawn, the brute gripping a crowbar that seemed all too comfortable in his large hands. "They're back," Ben muttered, glancing over his shoulder at Julie. Julie's face was pale but focused, her hand instinctively brushing against the pocket where she had stashed the journal. "They're looking for us." Ben nodded, his expression grim. "Stay low and don't make a sound." The two men moved through the camp methodically, their boots crunching in the snow as they inspected the dilapidated buildings. Their search wasn't rushed this time. It was deliberate, precise. They weren't leaving without results. Ben shifted slightly, his foot brushing against a loose board. The wood creaked under the weight, the sound faint but sharp in the oppressive quiet. He froze, but it was too late. The leader paused mid-step, his head tilting like a predator catching a scent. The stocky man raised a hand, motioning toward the shack. "Check in there," he said, his voice low but firm. The brute nodded and moved to the shack, his boots thudding heavily against the steps. "Julie," Ben whispered, gripping a broken plank from the floor. "When I say go, you head out the back." Julie's eyes darted to the rear of the shack, then back to Ben. "What about you?"
I'll handle him,
Ben said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Julie hesitated but nodded, her hand gripping the edge of the wall for balance. The brute pushed the door open, his bulk filling the frame as his eyes scanned the dim interior. Ben didn't wait for him to act. With a sharp swing, he brought the plank down hard against the man's head. The brute staggered back, grunting in pain, but he didn't go down. Instead, he swung the crowbar wildly, narrowly missing Ben as the fight erupted in the confined space. The two men grappled, their movements raw and desperate. Ben ducked another swing, slamming his shoulder into the brute's chest to push him off balance. The man was strong, and every move felt like pushing against a brick wall. "Stay down," the leader barked, entering the shack with his pistol raised. Julie didn't hesitate. Grabbing the rusted tool rack leaning against the wall, she shoved it over with a crash. The chaos sent a cascade of old metal parts tumbling to the floor, forcing the leader to lurch back and lose his aim. Ben took advantage of the distraction. With a quick move, he twisted the crowbar out of the brute's grip and delivered a sharp strike to his knee. The big man went down with a guttural cry, clutching his leg. The leader swung his pistol back toward Ben, but Ben was faster. He closed the distance in 2 strides, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it hard. The gun clattered to the floor, and with a final punch to the jaw, Ben sent the leader sprawling. "Go!" Ben shouted to Julie. She slipped out of the back of the shack, and Ben followed a moment later, leaving the two men groaning on the floor behind them. The cold hit them like a wall as they emerged into the open. Snow fell steadily, covering their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. Ben grabbed Julie's arm, pulling her towards the dense line of trees.
this way,
he said, his voice low but urgent. "Isn't the car back through the camp?" Julie asked, glancing over her shoulder. "They'll expect that," Ben said. "This cuts through the forest. If we move fast, we can circle back and get to the SUV before they regroup." Julie didn't argue, her breath coming in quick, visible puffs as she followed Ben into the trees. The forest closed in around them, the towering pines blocking out what little light the overcast sky offered. Their boots crunched through the deep snow, the sound muted by the oppressive quiet. Behind them, faint voices rose above the wind. "Find them," the leader growled. "Griggs won't care how." Chapter 11. The SUV groaned in protest as its tires slipped on the icy, rutted mining road. Ben tightened his grip on the wheel, leaning forward as if sheer determination could help him see through the swirling storm outside. Snow lashed against the windshield, the wipers barely keeping up. The faint hum of the heater was the only sound inside the cabin, a thin layer of warmth battling the chill that seeped through the doors. Julie sat in the passenger seat, her legs braced against the dashboard and the miner's journal open on her lap. The map's crude lines were faint under the weak glow of her flashlight, and she tilted the page this way and that, trying to make sense of its twists and turns. "You sure we're still on the right track?" Ben asked, his voice strained as the tires hit another patch of ice. Julie didn't look up. "About as sure as you are that this rental is built for Alaskan storms." Ben scowled. "This rental is supposed to be built for extreme conditions. That's what the guy said. I'm starting to think his definition of extreme was driving it off a paved road into a light drizzle." Julie smirked faintly, but kept her eyes on the map. "Turn left up ahead." Ben squinted at the snow-covered trail, which looked more like a vague indentation in the endless white. "You mean onto that? That's not a road, Jules. That's a suggestion."
It's where the tracks are supposed to be, she said firmly. See the marks on the map? It's just ahead.
Ben sighed heavily, but turned the wheel, easing the SUV onto the barely there path. The vehicle lurched, its tires crunching over what looked like wooden ties barely visible under the snow. Rusted metal rails peeked through here and there, their edges jagged with age. "There," Julie said, pointing into the distance. Ben followed her gaze, the faint beams of the headlights catching on the end of the trail. The remnants of the rail line disappeared into a dense grove of trees, leaving only a narrow opening that looked more like a portal to nowhere than the next step in their journey. He brought the SUV to a stop, the engine's hum settling into a quiet purr. "This is it," Julie said, her tone more confident than before. Ben didn't answer immediately. He stared at the narrow trail ahead, then at the ominous line of trees that seemed to be closing in on them. Finally, he let out a long breath. "Of course it is." They stepped out into the biting wind, their boots crunching in the snow as they moved to the back of the vehicle. Ben opened the hatch, pulling out their gear, a collection of thick coats, gloves, and scarves that they layered quickly over their clothes. Julie tucked the journal into the inner pocket of her coat, patting it once for reassurance. "You good?" Ben asked, slinging a small pack over his shoulder. Julie nodded, adjusting her scarf. "Let's do this." They waded into the waist-deep snow, following the faint remains of the rail line as it wound its way through the trees. Each step was an effort, the snow dragging at their legs and the cold seeping into every exposed inch of skin. Julie kept her eyes on the faint landmarks described in the journal, her breath visible in short bursts as she tried to match the crude map to their surroundings. "This storm isn't letting up," Ben said after a while, his voice cutting through the wind. "It's fine," Julie replied, though her tone was more determined than confident. "We're close." Ben gave her a skeptical look, though she didn't see it. "Define close, because if we have to hike through another mile of this, I'm calling it." Julie shot him a glance over her shoulder. "You're not calling anything. We've come too far to turn back now." Ben muttered something under his breath, but kept trudging forward, his boots sinking deep into the drifts with each step. The snow-laden branches overhead creaked ominously, bending under the weight of the storm. The wind howled through the trees, its sound distorted and echoing as it bounced off the looming mountains on either side. "You know," Ben said after a while, "this whole setup feels like a bad idea." Julie glanced at him. "Since when has that stopped us?" Ben snorted. "Fair point." The trees began to thin, revealing a break in the landscape up ahead. Julie's pace quickened, her excitement barely hidden as she pushed through the last few feet of snow. Ben followed, his breath coming in sharp bursts as they stepped into the clearing. The rail line ended abruptly at the mouth of a partially collapsed tunnel. The jagged edges of the entrance jutted out like broken teeth, silhouetted against the gray sky. Snow and rubble choked the opening, though the faint outlines of rusted tracks could still be seen disappearing into the darkness beyond. Julie stopped a few feet from the entrance, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "This is it," she said softly, more to herself than to Ben. Ben came to a stop beside her, his gaze fixed on the tunnel. He let out a low whistle. "That doesn't look sketchy at all." Julie shot him a look. "It's a collapsed rail tunnel. What were you expecting, a red carpet?" "I was expecting it to look a little less like a death trap," Ben said, crossing his arms. "You know this thing could cave in at any second, right?" Julie didn't answer immediately. She pulled the journal from her pocket, flipping through the pages until she found the sketch of the tunnel. Her gloved finger traced the lines of the map, her mind working quickly as she compared it to what lay before them. "This has to be it," she said finally, her voice firm. "The coordinates match, and the journal mentions a collapse. This is where the rail line ends." Ben tilted his head, his expression skeptical. "So, what's the plan? We just walk in there and hope the roof doesn't come down on us?" Julie smiled faintly, her confidence unwavering. "We'll be careful." Ben shook his head, letting out a resigned sigh. "You're impossible, you know that?" Julie didn't reply. She took a step forward, the crunch of her boots breaking the stillness as she approached the tunnel entrance. The air felt colder here, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and made every breath feel like a struggle. She stopped just short of the rubble, her eyes scanning the jagged opening. "Looks solid enough," she said, more to herself than to Ben. Ben gave her an incredulous look. "You're kidding, right?" Julie glanced back at him, her expression calm but determined. "We didn't come this far to turn back." Ben sighed heavily, glancing at the ominous darkness of the tunnel. The snow was already starting to fill in their tracks, the storm showing no signs of letting up. He knew she was right. They couldn't turn back now, not with everything they'd been through. But that didn't mean he had to like it. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tinged with frustration. "But if this thing comes down, I'm blaming you." Julie smiled faintly, tucking the journal back into her pocket. "Noted." With that, she stepped forward, her boots crunching against the snow-covered rubble as she crossed the threshold into the tunnel. The darkness swallowed her almost immediately, leaving only the faint sound of her footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Ben hesitated for a moment longer, his instincts screaming at him to stay outside. But the sight of Julie disappearing into the shadows was enough to push him forward. He adjusted his pack and followed, the cold air growing heavier with each step. Inside the tunnel, the world narrowed to the faint beam of their flashlight and the sound of their breathing. The tracks disappeared into the darkness, their rusted edges barely visible under a thin layer of frost. Broken beams jutted out at odd angles, and the walls were rough with the marks of old tools. "Still think this is a good idea?" Ben asked, his voice echoing slightly. Julie glanced back at him, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. "Ask me again when we find what we're looking for." Chapter 12. The narrow shaft pressed in tighter with every step. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faintest promise of light ahead. Julie's breathing was shallow and uneven, her gloved hands sliding along the cold, damp stone walls to guide her forward. Every sound, her footsteps, Ben's labored breathing, the distant explosions, felt amplified, pressing against her ears and her nerves. "Keep moving," Ben urged from behind, his voice tight with urgency. "I'm trying," Julie shot back, though her voice wavered. The walls seemed to close in more with every step, and the air grew colder, thinner, carrying the metallic tang of dust and rock. Another explosion rocked the shaft, the vibrations traveling through the walls like a pulse. Dust and loose debris rained down on them, and Ben grunted as he shielded his face with an arm.
"They're trying to seal us in,"
Ben said, more to himself than to Julie. "No kidding," Julie snapped, her nerves fraying as she pressed forward. The faint current of air ahead carried the icy bite of the storm outside. She focused on it, clinging to the hope that they were almost out. A sudden, louder crack reverberated behind them, and the ground beneath Julie's feet shifted. She stumbled forward, catching herself against the jagged wall. "Go!" Ben shouted, steadying her with a firm hand before pushing her forward. The light ahead grew brighter, cutting through the suffocating darkness. Julie dropped to her knees and crawled the last few feet, the freezing wind hitting her face like a slap as she emerged onto the mountainside. Ben tumbled out after her, coughing and swearing as he rolled onto his back. The rumble of another explosion echoed through the mountain and more rocks fell, blocking the opening behind them with a thunderous crash. Julie pushed herself upright, shivering as the storm wrapped around her. The snow was blinding, falling in thick, swirling sheets that reduced the world to a void of white. The wind howled, fierce and unrelenting, carrying with it the biting cold that cut through their coats like knives. "You okay?" Ben asked, his voice raised to be heard over the storm. Julie nodded, pulling her scarf tighter around her face. "Yeah. You?" "Peachy," Ben muttered, brushing snow off his jacket. He glanced back at the blocked shaft. "Looks like they got what they wanted. Tunnel's gone." Julie didn't respond immediately. She pulled herself to her feet, her legs unsteady as she reached into her pocket. Her fingers found the smooth surface of the metal plaque, and she pulled it out, brushing snow from its surface. The engraved words gleamed faintly in the gray light. "The heart of the mountain lies below." "What are you doing?" Ben asked, frowning as he stepped closer. Julie held up the plaque, her breath visible as she spoke. It's the key." "To what? Getting us killed?" Ben gestured around them. "We're lucky we made it out of there alive, and now you want to chase riddles in a blizzard?" Julie ignored him, pulling the journal from her other pocket. She flipped it open, her fingers numb as she found the page with the cipher sketch. It's all connected. The plaque, the journal, the ornament, it's a map. Ben crossed his arms, his skepticism plain. A map to where? Below could mean anything. It could mean the tunnel we just escaped from. And guess what? That's not an option anymore. Julie shook her head, her gaze fixed on the journal. "No, it's not talking about the tunnel itself. It's talking about what was transported on the rail line. The miners left clues in their carvings, and the rail car in the tunnel was part of it." Ben raised an eyebrow. "So what? You think the gold's in another rail car?" "Yes," Julie said, her voice firm. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp despite the snow whipping around them.
"The last intact rail car from this line is at the train museum back in town. It has to be a piece of the puzzle."
Ben groaned, running a hand through his snow-dusted hair. That's a big leap, Jules. You're betting everything on a clue that might not even mean what you think it does. I'm not betting, Julie shot back. The miners used the rail line to hide the shipment. They carved the cipher into the tunnel walls, marked the crates, and left a trail for anyone who knew how to follow it. There weren't any intact rail cars in there because they've been picked clean. I think the museum's car, the only one we've seen that hasn't been taken apart completely, is part of that trail. Ben stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. The storm howled around them, snow piling up at their feet as the wind cut through the thin layers of their coats. "So, let me get this straight," Ben said finally. "You want us to hike back to town in this," he gestured at the blizzard, "on the off chance that this car has the next piece of your treasure map?" "No, I want us to hike back to our car. Then we can head to town." She paused. "Look, if Griggs figures it out before we do, it's over anyway," Julie said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We don't have time to wait out the storm. He's already ahead of us, especially since we led his guys to the tunnel. If there's any chance they figure out that the rail car in the museum might be a clue, we have to beat them there." Ben sighed heavily, shaking his head. "You're impossible. You know that?" Julie smiled faintly, tucking the journal and plaque back into her pockets. "You've mentioned." Without waiting for his agreement, she turned and started trudging toward the faint outline of the trail leading back up the mountain toward the dilapidated road their SUV was on. Her boots sank deep into the snow, each step a struggle as the wind whipped around her. Ben lingered for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the white void around them. The mountains loomed dark and distant against the blizzard, their peaks barely visible through the swirling snow. Finally, he let out another sigh and followed her, his boots crunching through the fresh drifts. "This better be worth it," he muttered, pulling his scarf tighter against the wind. "If I lose a toe to frostbite, I'm holding you personally responsible." She laughed. "Don't worry, that's gross. If you lose a toe, I'll just leave you." Chapter 13. The town was alive with the glow of Christmas cheer as Ben and Julie made their way down the quiet back streets. Twinkling lights adorned every building, and garlands hung across the narrow roads, their red ribbons fluttering gently in the evening breeze. Carolers sang in the town square, their voices carried on the crisp air, mingling with the faint sound of laughter and clinking cider mugs. It was the perfect postcard scene of holiday joy, but to Ben, it felt like a facade. Every cheerful sound grated against the tension thrumming through his body. He scanned the streets with practiced caution, his gaze darting to every shadow and unfamiliar face. The storm had passed, but the air carried a biting chill that seemed to deepen the unease settling in his gut. Julie walked beside him, her head down, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets. She looked outwardly calm, like any other festival-goer, but Ben could see the tension in her clenched jaw, the stiffness in her stride. "Town doesn't have a clue, does it?" Ben muttered, nodding toward the square. Julie glanced at the carolers, her expression tight. "Not yet." The inn was quiet when they arrived, the noise from the festival fading into the background. Warmth enveloped them as they stepped inside, the faint scent of wood smoke and pine needles filling the air. It was deceptively inviting, but Ben's instincts prickled at the edges of his awareness. Something was wrong. The clerk at the front desk avoided their eyes, fidgeting with a stack of papers that didn't seem to need organizing. Two unfamiliar men loitered near the stairs, pretending to scroll through their phones, but casting furtive glances at Ben and Julie. "We're not alone," Ben muttered as they climbed the stairs. "I noticed," Julie replied, her voice low. They entered their room quickly, locking the door behind them. Julie moved to her bag, slipping the journal into the hollowed-out compartment inside before tucking the plaque beneath the bed. Her movements were quick and deliberate, but Ben could see the tension in her hands. A sharp knock at the door cut through the room like a gunshot. It wasn't the polite tap of housekeeping. It was firm, insistent, a demand. Julie froze.
"Here we go,"
Ben said grimly. He stepped to the door, adjusting his coat as he opened it. Standing there was a man Ben had never seen before, but he didn't need an introduction. The tailored wool coat, leather gloves, and polished boots gave him away as easily as the two men standing behind him with stiff postures and hard stares.
"Mr. Bennett,"
the man said smoothly, stepping inside before Ben could stop him. His presence filled the room like smoke, subtle but suffocating. So he knows our names, Ben thought. That's not a great sign. He wondered if the exuberant lady at the front desk had outed them. Julie moved to stand beside Ben, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "Can I help you?" Ben asked, trying to sound casually annoyed. Whatever that means. He didn't like that the guy had simply invited himself into the room, especially since he wasn't armed. But it had happened so fast, and it wasn't like Ben was about to try to attack the guy. The man frowned, then quickly regained his composure, his smile growing.
"I see you've been busy,"
Griggs said, looking around the room with a faint smile. "Poking around in places you don't belong." Ben crossed his arms. "If you're here to sell us a timeshare, I'm not interested." Griggs chuckled, low and humorless. Always the quick wit. I appreciate that. His gaze settled on Julie. But this isn't about humor. It's about history. My town's history.
"Your town?"
Julie asked, her tone icy. Griggs turned his full attention to her, his smile never wavering. "I've done more for this town in 5 years than anyone else has in 50. That includes protecting it from people who don't know when to leave well enough alone." Ben stepped forward, his voice hard. "And by protecting, you mean buying up property and hiring thugs to do your dirty work?" Griggs raised an eyebrow. "I don't know what you're talking about."
"Sure, you don't,"
Ben said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Griggs sighed, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. "Look, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to offer you a way out. Whatever you found, whatever you think you found, it's not worth what you're risking." Julie straightened, her jaw tightening. "We're not risking anything except exposing the truth." Griggs's expression darkened slightly. "The truth, Mrs. Bennett, is rarely as noble as people like to believe. What you've stumbled upon, however incomplete, is dangerous. Not just for you, but for the entire town. Do you have any idea what would happen if that gold were found? If the wrong kind of people got wind of it?" "Like you?" Ben asked, his voice sharp. Griggs ignored him, his gaze fixed on Julie. "Developers would turn this town into a circus. Tourists would flood in, bringing crime, greed, chaos. The very soul of hope would be lost. I won't let that happen." "And your family's connection to the miners?" Julie shot back. "The ledger? The deals? You'd rather erase the past than face it." For the first time, Griggs's calm veneer cracked, a flash of anger flickering across his face. He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "That ledger is a myth, a legend, like most of what you've probably heard about me. What's real is the destruction this so-called truth will bring." "And you're just here to help, right?" Ben said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Griggs's smile returned, cold and sharp. "I'm here to make sure this town survives. Walk away now, and I'll ensure your family's future is secure. Your daughter, what's her name? Hope? She'll never want for anything." The words hit Ben like a gut punch, his fists clenching at his sides. So this guy did some research of his own. As the leader of the now popular civilian special operations, Ben's face, and unfortunately, his exploits had been plastered across newspapers and online journals across the United States. He wasn't afraid of this man. But the image of his little girl flashed through his mind. Her bright smile, her laugh. The risks they were taking apparently weren't just theirs. They were hers, too. Julie's voice cut through the tension, clear and unyielding. "I'm going to take that as a threat, Wendell. We're not for sale, and the truth isn't yours to bury." Griggs's expression hardened, his polite facade slipping entirely. "Suit yourself, but don't think for a second that this is over." He motioned to someone standing just outside. 2 men appeared in the doorframe, and Ben's jaw clenched. He forced himself to wait. He wasn't going to do anything to provoke these men, but wasn't going to back down either. Griggs's voice cut through the tension. "Enjoy the festival while you can," he said, his voice calm once more. "I'll see you again soon." With that, he turned and left, his men following. Julie exhaled slowly, crouching to retrieve the plaque from under the bed. "Well, that went about as expected." Ben rubbed the back of his neck, frustration etched into his features. "The guy's got the town wrapped around his finger, and now he knows we're on to him." Julie tucked the plaque into her coat, her expression resolute. "We have to move fast. It's only a matter of time before they figure out why we came back. We need to get to the museum before they finish putting their pieces together." Ben leaned against the wall, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to be involved in this, but Griggs had made it clear he wasn't backing down. Ben smiled. "In that case, neither am I." Chapter 14. The room was eerily quiet after Griggs and his men left. Ben stood by the door for a moment, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. The tension hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. Julie moved quickly, pulling the journal from the hollow compartment in her bag and inspecting it. Her hands worked efficiently, but Ben noticed the tremble in her fingers. She didn't look at him as she checked the pages, her focus unyielding. "Well," she said finally, her voice cutting through the silence, "that was enlightening." Ben exhaled sharply, leaning back against the wall. Enlightening? The guy waltzed in here, threw out some veiled threats, and walked out like he owns the place. Julie tucked the journal back into her coat. "He does own the place in a way. At least, he thinks he does. But that's not what I mean." She turned to face him, her expression sharp. "He's scared." Ben raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "That's not the vibe I got." "He wouldn't have come here otherwise," Julie insisted. "He's desperate. He knows we're close to something and he's trying to scare us off." Ben let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "If that's desperation, I'd hate to see him when he's calm. He's got the whole town in his pocket, Jules, and now he knows we're on to him." "Exactly," Julie said, stepping closer. "Which means we don't have time to sit around. If he figures out the museum's connection before we do, it's over." Ben sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're talking about breaking into a public museum on Christmas Eve." Julie tilted her head, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. "You've done crazier things." "Not during the holidays," Ben muttered, though he couldn't suppress a small grin. He pushed off the wall, moving to the bed where Julie had stashed the plaque earlier. He pulled it out and turned it over in his hands, studying the engraved words. "The heart of the mountain lies below." "This is it," he said quietly, more to himself than to Julie. "It is," Julie replied, her voice firm. "The rail car in the museum has to be connected. It's the last intact piece of the line. If there's anything left to find, it'll be there." Ben slipped the plaque into his coat pocket, nodding. "All right, let's get this over with." They didn't have much to gather, just their coats, gloves, and scarves. Their gear, such as it was, consisted of the journal and the plaque. Julie adjusted her coat, making sure the journal was secure, while Ben pocketed the car keys. Within moments, they were stepping out into the cold night. The town square was still alive with Christmas cheer, the glow of twinkling lights reflecting off the fresh snow. Carolers sang near the large tree in the center of the square, their voices carried on the crisp air. Ben and Julie kept to the shadows as they made their way toward the outskirts of town, avoiding the crowds and sticking to the quieter streets. Ben glanced at Julie as they walked, noting the tension in her stride. "You've got that look." "What look?" she asked, keeping her eyes ahead. "The look that says you're about to dive headfirst into something insane." Julie smirked faintly. "It's a good look for me." Ben shook his head, but he didn't argue. She was right, after all. This wasn't the first time they'd found themselves in over their heads, and it probably wouldn't be the last. The museum sat on the edge of town, a modest building surrounded by a low wrought iron fence. It was dark and quiet, its windows reflecting the faint glow of the town's lights in the distance. Ben parked their rental SUV a few blocks away, cutting the engine and turning to Julie. "You're sure about this?" he asked. Julie nodded, her expression resolute. "It's the only lead we have. If Griggs beats us to it—" "He won't," Ben said firmly. "Let's move." They approached the museum cautiously, sticking to the shadows and keeping their movements quiet. The air was bitterly cold, their breaths visible in the dim light. Snow crunched beneath their boots, the sound too loud in the stillness. As they reached the fence, Ben tested the gate and found it locked. He glanced at Julie, who raised an eyebrow. "Ideas?" Ben scanned the fence, his mind working quickly. "We climb it." Julie frowned, glancing at the wrought iron spikes, not exactly subtle. "You got a better idea?" Ben asked. Julie sighed, shaking her head. "Fine, but if I rip my coat, you owe me a new one." Ben grinned. "Deal." They scaled the fence carefully, the cold metal biting at their gloved hands. Julie landed softly on the other side, dusting snow off her coat as Ben dropped down beside her. The museum loomed ahead, its darkened windows like watchful eyes. Ben's stomach tightened as they crossed the courtyard, every sense on high alert. The building was quiet, too quiet. Something felt off. He stopped suddenly, placing a hand on Julie's arm. "Wait!" Julie froze, her gaze darting around. "What is it?" Ben tilted his head toward the side of the building where a faint shadow moved across the snow. His voice was barely a whisper. "We're not alone." Julie's breath hitched, her eyes narrowing as she followed his gaze. The shadow grew larger, resolving into the shape of a man stepping around the corner. He moved with deliberate intent, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. Another figure followed close behind, both dressed in dark coats. "Griggs' men," Julie murmured. Ben's jaw tightened as he reached for her hand. "Come on, let's find another way in." Chapter 15. The museum loomed dark and quiet, its twinkling Christmas lights a sharp contrast to the tension Ben and Julie carried as they approached the side door. Snow crunched beneath their boots, the only sound in the still night. Julie knelt by the door, inspecting the lock. "It's not complicated, but I need something thin to work it," she muttered, frowning. Ben scanned the area, his eyes landing on a crumpled piece of chicken wire poking out from the snow near a maintenance shed. He grabbed it, shaking off the flakes. "This work?" Julie examined the wire, nodding as she began bending it into a makeshift tool. "Crude, but perfect. Sometimes you just need a little luck." She worked the lock with practiced precision, the faint clinks and clicks cutting through the cold silence. After a moment, the lock gave way with a soft thunk. Julie smirked as she pushed the door open. "I don't want to know where you learned that," Ben muttered as they stepped inside. Julie grinned over her shoulder. You'd be surprised what you pick up when you're bored in the middle of nowhere. The warmth inside was tempered by the lingering scent of coal and sulfur, mixed with the musty aroma of aged wood and rust. Their flashlights swept over the scene, revealing displays of mining tools, faded photographs, and relics from the town's railroad history. The damage from the earlier break-in was still visible. Several display cases had shattered glass replaced by hasty plywood patches, and papers and artifacts were stacked haphazardly on tables. Still a mess, Ben murmured. Griggs' guys weren't exactly gentle. They weren't looking for answers, Julie said quietly. They were looking to cover them up. They moved deeper into the museum, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Each creak of the wooden floorboards made Ben's nerves tighten, a constant reminder that they weren't alone in this. He scanned every dark corner, every glint of light reflecting off the patched-up displays. In the back of the museum, the centerpiece of the collection loomed, a restored mining rail car, its red paint faded but still striking. A brass plaque glinted in the beam of Julie's flashlight. Car number 97, Heart of the Mountain Line. Julie climbed the narrow steps leading to the car's entrance, her flashlight revealing the sooty interior. The air inside carried the distinct tang of coal mixed with the earthy scent of old wood. Ben followed, his boots thudding softly against the steps. "Check the floor," Julie instructed, kneeling near one of the benches. Ben crouched on the opposite side, tapping and pressing along the wooden panels. After a few minutes, Julie's fingers brushed against a faint seam. "Here," she whispered. She pried the panel open with a crowbar she'd grabbed from an earlier display. Inside was a small wooden box and a loose fragment of gold, its surface rough and unpolished, as if it had just been pulled from the mine. "Gold from the operation," Julie murmured, holding it up to the light. Ben stared at it, the dull gleam catching his eye. So the stories weren't just stories. Julie opened the wooden box carefully. Inside were a few pages of handwritten notes, faded but legible. She scanned them quickly, her breath hitching when she found a sketch of a map marked with an X. "This isn't just about the gold in the mine," she said, her voice rising with excitement. "They moved it, Ben, most of it. The journal mentions a shipment that never left town." "Where?" Ben asked, leaning closer. Julie pointed to the sketch. "This looks like the old churchyard. It's not far from here." Ben raised an eyebrow. "A churchyard? That's where they hid their gold?" "It makes sense," Julie said, tucking the map into her coat. "A quiet spot, plenty of places to dig without anyone noticing, if it's still there." She didn't finish the thought, but Ben caught the gleam in her eyes. This wasn't just about the gold anymore. It was about unraveling the last piece of the puzzle. Suddenly, the crunch of boots on snow outside pulled them back to the present. Ben froze, his flashlight clicking off as he grabbed Julie's arm. "Griggs' men," he whispered. Julie stuffed the map and the gold fragment into her pocket, her heart pounding as she listened to the muffled voices growing closer. "What do we do?" Ben scanned the room, his mind racing. He spotted a display of mining equipment nearby, including a small dynamo-powered lamp. He grabbed it, twisting the crank to generate power. The light flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the rail car. "Stay quiet," he murmured, setting the lamp near the edge of the car. "What are you doing?" Julie hissed. "Distracting them," Ben said, moving quickly to grab a stack of old mining helmets and scattering them around the car. He set one on the lamp, its reflective surface catching the light and creating ghostly movement across the walls. The effect was immediate. The voices outside grew louder, confused, as the men spotted the shifting light and shadows through the rail car windows. "What's that?" one of them barked.
I don't know, but it's moving,
Another replied. Ben pulled Julie toward the back of the car, guiding her out the emergency exit and into the darkened museum. They slipped through the side door just as the men entered the main hall, their flashlights darting toward the rail car. Outside, the night was cold and still, the snow crunching beneath their boots as they made their way to the alley where they'd parked. Ben glanced back, watching the museum shrink into the distance. "Let's hope that bought us enough time," he said, his breath visible in the freezing air. Julie clutched her coat tightly, her expression resolute. "It's not just the gold, Ben. It's the truth. Griggs isn't just protecting his family's reputation. He's built his whole life on lies. If we can prove that, then he's finished," Ben said, nodding. "But we're not there yet." Julie smiled faintly, her determination undimmed. "We will be."
Chapter 16.
Ben and Julie slipped out the side door of the museum, moving quickly and quietly into the snowy streets. The night was still, the fresh snow muffling their footsteps as they made their way toward the edge of town. Julie clutched the ledger tightly to her chest, her breaths coming fast and shallow. "We're not driving," Ben whispered, his eyes scanning the empty road ahead. "If Griggs sees the car, it'll lead them straight to us." Julie nodded, her jaw set. "The churchyard isn't far. We can make it on foot." They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows and keeping to side streets as much as possible. The festive glow of Christmas lights in the town square felt worlds away, the muffled sounds of carolers and laughter only amplifying the tension thrumming between them. Halfway to the churchyard, Ben stopped abruptly, his hand on Julie's arm. "Wait." Julie froze, her heart pounding as she followed his gaze toward the main street. The distant crunch of boots on snow reached her ears, faint but deliberate. She turned to Ben, her voice barely audible. "Griggs' men?" Ben nodded, his expression grim.
Could be. We need to get off the street.
They spotted an old shack just ahead, its roof sagging under the weight of snow. The windows were broken and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. It wasn't much, but it would give them cover. Ben ushered Julie inside, pulling the door shut behind them as quietly as he could. The interior was dark and barren, the remnants of an old cot and a broken chair scattered across the warped wooden floor. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew and decay. The shack was silent except for the occasional creak of its weathered frame. Ben crouched near a crack in the wall, watching the faint beams of flashlight sweep through the snow outside. Julie knelt nearby, her expression tense but focused. "They're searching," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. Julie nodded, her breathing slow and deliberate. "How close?" Ben didn't answer immediately. Through the narrow crack, he spotted 3 figures approaching. Griggs walked at the center of the group, his tailored coat immaculate even in the harsh weather. Beside him was the young police officer they'd met at the station, his flashlight casting wide arcs across the snow. The third figure, a burly man with a thick scarf covering most of his face, trudged slightly behind, his flashlight angled toward the ground.
They brought the cop,
Ben muttered, his voice laced with frustration.
That's why the police haven't done anything. He's working for Griggs.
Julie frowned, her grip on the ledger tightening. "How much does he know?" "Enough to sell us out," Ben replied, his jaw tightening. "Stay quiet." The voices outside grew louder as Griggs and his men stopped near the shack. "I told you," the officer was saying, his tone defensive. "I saw tracks heading this way. They didn't just disappear." The burly man kicked at a mound of snow, his voice rough.
"Well, they're gone now."
"You sure it was them?" "Who else would it be?" the officer snapped. Plenty of folks wandering around at night with all the festival crap going on, the man shot back. They could have gone anywhere. Griggs's calm voice cut through the argument. If you're finished bickering, perhaps you could focus on finding them instead of wasting my time. The officer bristled, but kept quiet, his flashlight sweeping over the ground again. I'm telling you, they came this way. The winds covered most of the tracks, but they couldn't have gotten far. Griggs exhaled sharply, his irritation clear. Then find them, or are you trying to tell me you can't do the one thing I'm paying you for? The burly man snorted. If they're not here, maybe they doubled back. Could be heading for the road. They wouldn't risk the road, the officer argued. Not if they think we're watching it. Do they even know we're out here? The burly man shot back. For all we know, they're sitting somewhere laughing at us. Enough, Griggs snapped, his voice icy. Spread out, check the area thoroughly. They didn't vanish. The group moved slightly apart, their flashlights darting between trees and over snowdrifts. Ben held his breath, watching as one of the beams lingered on the shack's warped doorframe. His pulse quickened as the officer stepped closer, peering at the ground near the entrance. Anything? Griggs called from a few paces back. The officer hesitated, his flashlight shifting over the undisturbed snow near the door. No, but they're close. I can feel it. Griggs muttered something inaudible, his tone curt. He gestured for the group to fan out, their voices fading as they moved towards the edge of the woods. The snow muffled their footsteps, leaving only the faint rustle of branches in their wake. Ben exhaled slowly, pulling back from the wall. They're gone. For now. Julie crept closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Do they know where we're going? No, Ben said, shaking his head. They're guessing, but we need to keep moving before they double back. Julie nodded, tucking the ledger deeper into her coat. The churchyard? Ben glanced toward the back door, his ears straining for any lingering sounds. Yeah. Stick to the trees, no lights, no noise. They slipped out through the back of the shack, moving quickly and quietly toward the woods. The snow was deep, but muffled their footsteps as they weaved between the towering trees. Julie stayed close behind Ben, her breaths steady despite the chill in the air. What about the cop? She whispered. What do we do about him? Ben's jaw tightened. Not much we can do right now. We deal with Griggs first. Julie nodded, though her grip on the ledger remained tight. As they approached the edge of the woods, the faint outline of the churchyard fence came into view. A rusted iron barrier half buried in snow, its spires jutting into the night like skeletal fingers. Julie glanced back toward the town, her voice low. You think they'll figure it out? Maybe, Ben said, his tone clipped, but not before we get there. Chapter 17. The iron gate stood half buried in snow, its rusted hinges stiff as Ben pushed it open with a low groan. Julie stepped through after him, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. The churchyard stretched before them, an expanse of snow-draped headstones and twisted iron fences. The church loomed in the background, its silhouette stark against the overcast night sky. This doesn't just look like a churchyard, Julie said, brushing snow off her gloves. It's a graveyard, probably the oldest in town. Ben nodded, scanning the rows of markers. Makes sense. The first settlers would have been buried here. Let's hope one of them has something useful to say. Julie smirked faintly at his sarcasm but didn't reply. She crouched beside one of the markers, wiping away the snow to reveal a simple engraving. James Carter, 1874 to 1919, she read aloud. Just a name and dates. no epitaph. Ben eyed the surrounding stones, all worn smooth by time and weather. Looks like they didn't have much room for sentimentality. Julie straightened and moved to the next marker, her breath visible in the freezing air. If there's a clue here, it has to tie back to the miners, something about Grady's hope. Or Jacob Grady himself, Ben said, moving further into the yard. The snow muted their footsteps, the silence pressing in around them. If he's buried here, there's a reason. Maybe he left something behind. Julie stopped suddenly, her eyes catching on a larger headstone partially buried beneath a mound of snow. She knelt, brushing the surface clean with quick, deliberate movements. Ben, over here. He joined her, his eyebrows raising as the inscription came into view. In loving memory of Jacob the Mountain Grady, 1851 to 1922, first mayor of Hope. The Mountain, Ben muttered. Hell of a nickname. Julie stared at the name, her brow furrowed in thought. Jacob Grady, founder of Grady's Hope Mining Company. He's the one who supposedly hid the gold. Ben crouched beside her, his eyes scanning the large headstone. And they buried him in the churchyard? That's convenient. Convenient for us, Julie said, brushing more snow from the base. Look, there's something here. Ben followed her gaze, his breath hitching as he saw the faint carving near the ground. It was a simple mark, but unmistakable. The same cipher they'd seen in the journal and on the plaque. The symbol was accompanied by an arrow, barely visible, pointing downward. Julie's fingers lingered on the engraving, her voice soft but resolute. The miners left this. It's deliberate. Ben leaned back, his jaw tightening. So, the journal was right. The ledger, the gold, it all ties back to this place. Julie stood, brushing snow from her knees. This grave is proof the story's true. Griggs's family, the gold, it's all connected. Ben frowned, his eyes narrowing at the marker. If we dig here, we'll be giving Griggs exactly what he wants. Julie shook her head firmly. We're not digging. We don't need the gold. We have the ledger, and that's enough. We just needed to confirm the story. Ben stood as well, his gaze shifting toward the churchyard gate. Then we've done what we came for. Let's get out of here before Griggs figures out where we've gone. Julie hesitated, her eyes lingering on the grave. Do you think anyone else has been here? Griggs or his men? Ben shook his head. If they had, we wouldn't be standing here right now. But they're not far behind us. Let's go. They moved quickly back toward the gate, their movements cautious but determined. The snow continued to fall in gentle waves, covering their tracks as they weaved between the rows of headstones. Julie clutched the ledger tightly against her chest, her mind racing with what they'd found. At the edge of the yard, Ben paused, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the fence. The churchyard confirms it, but we still need a plan. The ledger's explosive, sure, but we have to deliver it in the right way. Julie nodded, adjusting her scarf. Griggs will do everything he can to discredit us. We can't let him get ahead of the story. Which means we have to stay ahead of him, Ben said, his tone resolute. He opened the gate slowly, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. No more side trips. We get out of here and figure out our next move. Julie glanced back at the graveyard, her gaze lingering on Jacob Grady's headstone. Do you think anyone knew? About the gold, the ledger, any of it? Ben's expression softened slightly. Someone knew, and they buried it, literally and figuratively. Griggs just wants to make sure it stays that way. Julie exhaled slowly, her breath clouding in the air. Then let's make sure it doesn't.
Chapter 18.
The festival square was already bustling when Ben and Julie arrived. Snow dusted the rooftops and streets, lending a postcard-perfect charm to the scene. The towering Christmas tree sparkled with ornaments and lights, and the air buzzed with the cheerful sounds of carolers and townspeople preparing for the day's festivities. Since the town's first attempt at the Hope Ornament Festival had ended in disaster, the residents and guests were eager for a do-over. They'd planned to continue the ceremony and events today from where they'd left off, though no one was quite sure where the Hope Ornament actually was, or if it would somehow make a miraculous reappearance today. Julie kept her head down as she clutched the ledger tightly under her coat, her fingers gripping it like a lifeline. Ben walked beside her, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. They weaved through the bustling square toward the mayor's tent near the main stage. "Let me do the talking," Julie said quietly, her breath visible in the cold air. Ben gave a faint nod.
"Works for me."
The mayor's tent was a modest setup, decorated with garlands and a cheerful wreath on the flap. Inside, the space was functional, with a folding table, a few chairs, and stacks of papers neatly arranged in plastic bins. The mayor himself sat behind the table, a balding man in his 60s with kind eyes and a warm smile that didn't quite reach them. Julie stepped forward, her voice steady. "Mayor Franklin, can we have a moment of your time?" The mayor glanced up, his smile brightening. "Of course. Are you visiting for the festival? How can I help?" Julie hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed the ledger on the table. "We found something you need to see." Franklin's smile faltered as his eyes fell on the worn leather cover. He reached out tentatively, opening the ledger to the pages Julie had marked. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion as he scanned the lines of names, numbers, and notes. "What is this?" he asked, his tone cautious. "It's a ledger from Jacob Grady," Julie explained. "It details the origins of Grady's Hope Mining Company and some of the corruption tied to it. Wendell Griggs' family is implicated." The mayor looked up sharply, his face a mix of surprise and alarm. "Griggs?" Julie nodded. "He's been trying to erase this history, buying up property and silencing people who might expose the truth. This ledger proves it." The mayor flipped through the pages again, his fingers trembling slightly. "This is significant, but it's also delicate. Allegations like this could cause panic, damage the town's reputation." Julie's eyes narrowed. "The truth is what matters, Mayor. The town deserves to know." The mayor gave her a thin smile. "Of course. And I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I'll make sure it's handled properly." Julie frowned. "Handled?" The mayor stood, carefully closing the ledger and tucking it under his arm. "I'll review this and consult with the appropriate authorities. We need to proceed cautiously. These things take time." Ben's jaw tightened, but his tone remained calm. "Time isn't something we have. Griggs is still out there." Mayor Franklin held up a hand. "And I assure you, this will be addressed. Thank you for bringing it to me." Julie stepped forward.
"Wait, you're just going to keep it? You're not going to tell the town?"
The mayor's expression remained neutral. "It's my responsibility to protect this community. I'll do what's best for Hope." Ben placed a hand on Julie's arm, his voice low. "Let it go. For now." Julie shot him a glare but allowed herself to be guided out of the tent. Her chest burned with frustration as they stepped back into the bustling square. The noise of the festival felt like an affront, drowning out the urgency of what they had just handed over. Once they were safely out of earshot, Julie whirled on Ben, her voice sharp. He's not going to do anything. He's protecting Griggs. Ben nodded grimly.
Yeah, I caught that.
Julie paced a few steps, her hands clenched into fists. We can't let this die here. If the mayor buries it, he will. Ben interrupted, his tone steady. So we don't wait for him. We make the reveal ourselves.
Julie stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. How?
Ben's gaze swept over the square, landing on the festival stage. We use the festival. The whole town's here. If we make it public, the mayor can't bury it, and Griggs won't be able to spin it. Julie hesitated, then nodded. All right, let's do it. But how do we get the ledger back? Ben's smirk was faint but unmistakable. We don't. Chapter 19. Ben and Julie stood at the edge of the bustling crowd, keeping their movements casual, but both were acutely aware of the ledger tucked securely under the mayor's arm. Julie's jaw tightened as she watched him chatting amiably with townsfolk near his tent. To anyone else, he looked like a man at ease, playing his role as the friendly face of the festival. But Julie could see the subtle cracks in his performance, the nervous twitch of his fingers, the way his eyes darted toward the edge of the square every few moments. He's stalling, she muttered to Ben, her voice low enough to be swallowed by the festive chatter around them. He doesn't want to keep it. He's going to pass it off. Ben nodded, his sharp gaze fixed on the mayor. The question is, to who and when? Julie exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. Griggs, most likely. We need to follow him. If we lose sight of that ledger...
Stick close to me. Let's see where he goes.
The mayor lingered a few minutes longer, exchanging pleasantries with festival-goers before excusing himself. He stepped away from his tent, his movements brisk but not hurried as he made his way toward a quieter side street. Showtime, Ben murmured, tilting his head for Julie to follow. They trailed the mayor at a safe distance, weaving through the crowd and keeping to the shadows. The festive noise of the square faded as they moved further from the main thoroughfare. The side street was dimly lit, the snow crunching softly underfoot as the mayor's figure disappeared around a corner. Julie's pulse quickened as they approached the corner. If he hands it off to Griggs, then it's proof the mayor's in on it, Ben said.
Simple as that.
Julie shot him a skeptical look, but didn't argue. Together, they peered around the corner, careful not to be seen. The mayor stood near the entrance to a narrow alley between a cute coffee shop and an old, out-of-business filling station, his breath visible in the cold air. He glanced around nervously before pulling the ledger from under his coat. A moment later, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows behind the coffee shop. Wendell Griggs, his tailored coat and polished demeanor looking out of place in the dingy alleyway. Griggs, Julie whispered, her stomach twisting. Of course. Griggs's confident smile was visible even from their distance. He approached the mayor with a slow, deliberate stride, his voice low, but carrying an unmistakable air of authority. I assume you've kept this quiet? Griggs said, taking the ledger from the mayor's hands. The mayor nodded quickly. Yes, of course. No one else has seen it except those two visitors. I managed to convince them I'd handle it. Griggs chuckled softly, flipping through the pages of the ledger. Well done. This little book could have caused quite the stir. Fortunately, it's in the right hands now. Ben's fists clenched at his sides, his muscles coiled like a spring. Julie put a hand on his arm, her voice a barely audible whisper. Not yet. We need more. Griggs continued speaking, his tone casual. The ornament ceremony is the perfect distraction. Once the crowd is cheering my name, we'll take care of this permanently. Clearing his name. The mayor was involved with Griggs even more closely than she'd thought. The mayor hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. "You're sure no one can trace it back to us?" Griggs snapped the ledger shut, his smile turning cold. "They won't, as long as you keep playing your part." Julie's stomach churned with frustration as they watched the mayor nod meekly, clearly cowed by Griggs' presence. Ben leaned closer to her, his voice a low rumble. "We've got what we need. Let's move." They slipped away from the alley, retracing their steps back toward the square. Julie's mind raced, the weight of what they'd just witnessed pressing down on her. "He's not just protecting himself," she said quietly. "He's protecting Griggs' entire narrative." Ben nodded grimly, and using the ceremony to cement it. "If we don't act fast, the whole town will be eating out of his hand." Julie's pace quickened as they neared the edge of the square. "We need someone who can stop this, someone with authority." Ben's brow furrowed. "The sheriff." Julie glanced at him. "Do you trust him?" "Not yet," Ben admitted. "But he's our best shot, and the only one who has the power to do anything." The sheriff was standing near a food stall, chatting with a group of locals as he sipped a steaming cup of coffee. His tall, broad-shouldered frame and weathered face gave him a commanding presence, but his expression was relaxed, almost jovial. Ben approached first, his steps deliberate. "Sheriff Burleson, got a minute?" The sheriff turned, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as he sized Ben up. "You're the fellow from the museum, right, Bennett?" "That's me," Ben said, keeping his tone casual. "This is my wife, Julie." Burleson nodded at her, his expression polite but guarded. "Something I can help you with?" Julie glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot before speaking. "It's about Wendell Griggs and the mayor." The sheriff's brow furrowed, his grip tightening slightly on his coffee cup. "What about them?" Ben stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They're covering up a lot more than you realize. We've got proof." He pulled a folded page from the journal, a sketch of the Ornament's cipher alongside a note about Grady's dealings with Griggs's predecessors, and handed it to Burleson. The man studied it carefully, his expression unreadable. "This is quite serious," the sheriff said finally, his voice measured. "But you're accusing two of the most prominent people in this town of fraud. Possibly worse." Ben stared at him, steely-eyed. "Does that make it untrue?" The sheriff frowned, then sucked in a breath. "Hell no. Based on what I've heard and my gut, I'm inclined to believe you." Julie nodded firmly. "Because it's true. We just witnessed the mayor handing over a ledger to Griggs, even more evidence that links his family to corruption dating back to the town's founding. Griggs is using the ceremony to rewrite the narrative." Burleson's jaw tightened, and he looked between Ben and Julie. "If you're right, this could blow the roof off the whole town." Ben's gaze was steady. "That's the idea." The sheriff took a long breath, then straightened his shoulders. "All right, let's go see what they're up to." They moved quickly toward the square, the festive atmosphere feeling increasingly surreal against the weight of what was about to unfold. The sheriff stayed slightly ahead, his presence commanding enough to part the crowd without a word. As they neared the stage, Ben spotted Griggs standing near the mayor, the ledger tucked under his arm. Griggs was laughing, his demeanor relaxed as he chatted with a group of townspeople. Julie's stomach churned, but she forced herself to stay calm. Chapter 20. The sheriff's boots moved with purpose as he led Ben and Julie toward the heart of the festival square. Snow continued to drift lazily from the sky, masking the tension radiating from their small group. Around them, townsfolk sipped steaming cider, their laughter and chatter filling the air as children darted between the glowing Christmas lights. It was the idyllic charm of hope in full swing, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath its surface. Julie clutched the edges of her coat tightly, trying to keep her nerves in check. Her gaze darted toward the stage, where Mayor Franklin stood beside Wendell Griggs, their polished smiles gleaming under the bright holiday lights. In Griggs' hands, the ledger was hidden beneath the guise of a folded program, blending seamlessly with the festive surroundings. "We need to move fast," Julie said quietly, her breath fogging in the cold air. The sheriff's brow furrowed as he took in the scene ahead. "If I go charging in there without cause, it won't end well. Griggs has half the town in his pocket. I need something concrete." Ben's voice was low but firm. "The ledger's all the proof you need. You can see it in his hands right now." The sheriff hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Let me handle this my way." Julie stepped closer, her voice sharp with urgency. "Your way. He's about to take that stage and rewrite this town's history. If you don't act now, he'll bury the truth, and you'll never get another chance." The sheriff's gaze flicked to Julie, then to Ben, and finally back to the stage. His lips pressed into a thin line before he gave a curt nod. "Stay here. I'll be back." Julie crossed her arms, her eyes locked on the stage as the sheriff disappeared into the crowd. The mayor tapped the microphone at the podium, the sound cutting through the square and drawing the townspeople's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Franklin began, his warm smile radiating across the crowd, "thank you for joining us tonight for what promises to be a truly special moment in Hope's history." Ben muttered under his breath, "Special moment, my ass." Julie shot him a look. "Focus. We're not out of this yet." The mayor continued, gesturing to the golden ornament displayed on a pedestal beside him. Its gleaming surface reflected the twinkling lights, casting an almost ethereal glow over the stage. "As you all know, this beautiful artifact, our Hope ornament, was tragically stolen just 2 days ago," the mayor said, his tone heavy with false solemnity. "But thanks to the swift actions of one of our town's most devoted citizens, it has been recovered and returned to its rightful place." The crowd erupted in applause as Griggs stepped forward, his modest wave accompanied by a carefully practiced smile. Julie's stomach churned at the sight. "In addition, Mr. Griggs has informed me that his company will be fully funding the renovations our lovely little museum now requires. The obscene incident that took place here 2 days ago will be forgotten swiftly with the addition of a brand new foyer funded by the Griggs Holding Company." The crowd erupted in praise. Behind the stage, the sheriff emerged from the shadows, his approach deliberate and unnoticed by the gathered crowd. Ben caught sight of him first and gave a subtle nod. "Let's hope he knows what he's doing," Ben muttered. Julie's hands clenched into fists as Griggs reached for the microphone. "He'd better." Griggs' voice carried across the square with practiced ease. "Thank you, Mayor Franklin, and thank you, Hope, for your unwavering trust and support. It's moments like these that remind me why this town is so special. Its history, its traditions, they're worth protecting at all costs." Julie scoffed under her breath. "Protecting? More like erasing." The sheriff climbed the steps at the back of the stage, his presence finally drawing attention. The mayor's smile faltered, his eyes darting to Griggs, who stiffened slightly. "Sheriff Burleson," Franklin said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness, "what can we do for you?" The sheriff's tone was cool and measured. "Just here to keep an eye on things. Make sure everything's above board." Griggs' polished smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. We wouldn't want anything to disrupt this fine event." The sheriff's gaze lingered on Griggs' hand where the edge of the ledger was visible beneath the program. "Speaking of disruptions," he said slowly, "mind telling me what you've got there?" Griggs's fingers tightened on the ledger, his voice smooth. Oh, just some notes for my speech. Nothing important? The sheriff stepped closer, his expression hardening. Let me be the judge of that. The exchange was subtle enough to go unnoticed by most of the crowd, but Ben and Julie could see the tension radiating from the stage. Julie leaned closer to Ben, her voice low. If he pulls this off...
Let's not celebrate just yet,
Ben replied. The sheriff's voice grew louder, enough to carry to the front rows of the crowd. You've been doing a lot of talking about this town's history, Griggs. Care to explain how you got your hands on a piece of it? Griggs's polished demeanor cracked slightly, his smile faltering.
Sheriff, I don't appreciate being accused of...
I'm not accusing you of anything, the sheriff interrupted, his tone sharp. I'm just asking a simple question. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, rippling through the square like a wave. People craned their necks to see what was happening on stage, their festive cheer replaced by curiosity and confusion. Julie seized the moment. Stepping forward, she raised her voice, her words cutting through the growing murmur. Ask him about the ledger, Sheriff. The one his family's been trying to hide for decades. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and all eyes turned to Griggs. His face darkened, his polished image unraveling with every passing second. The sheriff reached out and with one swift motion, he pulled the ledger from Griggs' grip. He held it up for the crowd to see, his voice ringing out with authority. This is the truth Griggs and his family have been hiding. Records of corruption, theft, and deception tied to the very foundation of this town. The crowd erupted in a mix of outrage and disbelief, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus. Griggs took a step back, his calm demeanor giving way to anger. This is absurd, Griggs snapped, his voice cutting through the noise. That ledger is nothing but lies, fabricated to discredit me. Julie stepped closer to the stage, her voice steady and unyielding. Those names, those dates, they're real, and they prove that you've been exploiting this town for generations. The sheriff flipped open the ledger, pointing to a specific entry. Wendell Griggs, payments siphoned from Grady's Hope Mining Company. You've been lining your pockets while claiming to protect this town.
You don't have proof. Nothing but fabricated stories, like all the others you've heard about my family name.
The crowd stirred again, as if subtly shifting their alliance once more to the polished businessman they wanted to believe in. You want more proof? Julie said. That ornament was stolen by men you hired, Griggs. Your officer friend could attest to that, if he wasn't also on your payroll. The sheriff didn't blink. He must have already known about his subordinate's duplicity. But that's not all, Julie said, her voice cutting loudly through the winter air. What about this? She pulled out the ingot she'd stashed in her pocket earlier that day. A gasp from the crowd closest to her. This is gold, real gold from Grady's Hope, and we found it in the rail car inside the museum, the same rail car that came from the mine. It's proof of the lost shipment, and proof that Griggs has been using you all to look for it. Griggs seemed surprised by this revelation, but he didn't let up.
And where is that shipment? Surely the lost shipment wasn't just a single ingot.
Ben smiled. There's plenty more of it, Griggs, he snapped, ensuring his voice was loud enough for everyone around and on the stage could hear. But we're not telling, not you, not the mayor. Our story can be corroborated back at the police station if you'd like. Griggs' composure shattered, and he lashed out, his voice a desperate snarl.
Back at what? You don't understand. Without me, this town wouldn't survive. I've kept it alive.
The sheriff's voice was calm but firm. You've kept yourself alive, Griggs, at the expense of everyone else. Deputies stepped onto the stage, their presence signaling the end of the confrontation. The sheriff gestured to them, his tone final. "Take him in." He looked at Franklin as if considering whether or not to arrest him as well, but decided against it. As the deputies led Griggs away, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Julie exhaled a shaky breath, her tension melting into relief. Beside her, Ben smirked faintly. "Nice work." Julie glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips. We're not done yet. Chapter 21. The following morning, Hope felt like a different town. Snow still blanketed the streets, but the festive lights and decorations seemed to glow brighter. The tension of the previous evening had melted away, replaced by an air of anticipation and renewal. Townsfolk milled about the square, their conversations filled with murmurs about Wendell Griggs' arrest and the revelations from the ledger. Ben leaned against the railing of the inn's porch, sipping a steaming mug of coffee. He watched the townspeople bustle with purpose, noting the shift in their posture. There was no longer the weight of oblivious cheer. This was something deeper. A collective realization that their town's legacy was far more complicated and precious than they'd imagined. Julie stepped outside, pulling her scarf tighter against the chill. She carried a second mug of coffee and handed it to Ben. "You're up early," she said, her voice light but tired. Ben took the mug, smirking faintly. "Couldn't sleep. Too much excitement, I guess." Julie leaned on the railing beside him, her eyes scanning the square. "The sheriff said the ledger and the ingot are already locked up in the town's archive. They're starting the official investigation today." Ben nodded. "And Griggs?" "In custody. His lawyer's already spinning, but it won't hold. The ledger's solid evidence, and the town saw too much to ignore it." Ben sipped his coffee. Hard to believe they're finally free of him. Or close to it anyway. Julie's smile was faint but genuine. Sometimes people just need the truth shoved in their faces to wake up. The sound of footsteps on the porch drew their attention. Mayor Franklin approached, his hat in his hands, looking far less composed than the polished figure on stage the night before. His coat was wrinkled, his steps hesitant. "Morning," he said quietly. Julie's gaze sharpened. "Mayor." Franklin's lips pressed into a thin line as he stepped closer. "Not anymore. I was put into that position by Griggs. He's been orchestrating things around here for some time, but I'm done. I won't contribute to that sort of thing any longer. I just wanted to thank you. What you both did last night, it was risky, but it was the right thing." Julie's posture stiffened. "That's quite the flip-flop." The mayor winced. "I was scared. He's had his hooks in this town for so long I didn't think anyone could stand up to him. And truth be told, he's invested heavily into this town. Only the purists, the originals from here, Burleson, a few others, think they can make it without his money. But this town will survive. You reminded me that Hope's history isn't his to control." Ben raised an eyebrow. "So, what now?" The mayor stood straighter. "The sheriff's already working on the legal side of things, and the town council's calling an emergency meeting this afternoon. We'll make all of the ledger public. We have to. It's history, but it's our history, and that's what will get this place through." Julie studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good. Make sure you follow through. The people deserve the truth." By midday, the town square was alive again, the morning's tension replaced by cautious optimism. The ornament, now restored to its place of honor, sparkled at the heart of the festival in front of the museum. Beside it stood a hastily printed plaque explaining its historical significance, not just as a symbol of the town's heritage, but also as a reminder of the hard truths uncovered about its past. Julie and Ben wandered through the square, blending into the crowd as best they could. Townsfolk stopped to thank them, their gratitude quiet but heartfelt. A young boy ran up to Julie with a homemade ornament, pressing it into her hands before darting away, his cheeks red from both the cold and his excitement.
"This place is starting to grow on me,"
Ben said with a smirk. Julie glanced at him, a small smile tugging at her lips.
"Don't get too comfortable. We've got a kid waiting for us back home."
As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the town in warm hues of gold and pink, Julie and Ben stood at the edge of the square, their bags packed. The sheriff approached, his expression lighter than they'd ever seen it.
"Heading out?"
he asked. Julie nodded. "We've done what we came to do. The rest is up to you." The sheriff extended a hand, his grip firm. "You gave this town a fighting chance. Don't think we'll forget it."
Ben grinned faintly. "Let's hope you don't."
They started to turn away, but the sheriff stopped them again. "You mentioned knowing where the rest of the gold was hidden." Ben and Julie stared at him. Can you perhaps... Would you tell me?" Ben waited a long moment, unsure of what to do. Finally, his wife broke the silence. "I think that's the sort of legend that keeps a town running, don't you think? Gives it hope, if you will." The sheriff looked strangely at the pair for a moment, then smiled.
"Of course. Understood. You two drive safe now."
Ben chuckled and grabbed Julie's hand as they left the festival. As the two walked toward their SUV, the sound of carolers filled the air again. Snowflakes fell gently around them, and the warmth of the festival lingered behind. A quiet reminder that truth, no matter how buried, always found its way to the surface. Ben climbed into the driver's seat, glancing at Julie as she settled beside him. "Ready?" Julie looked back at the glowing square one last time, her expression soft but resolute. "Yeah, I've had enough vacation for a while."
This has been The Hope Ornament by Nick Thacker. Copyright 2025 by Conundrum Publishing. All rights reserved. ConundrumPub.com.